Chapter 1418. One of the reasons for making such a military decision was that Yang Qindong wanted a complete Bulgar city, not a ruined city. Not only that, he also wanted the Mongolian soldiers in the city. Considering the long journey, if the country sent troops here for everything, the losses would be too great. If he could get a Mongolian army here for his own use, the problem of insufficient military strength could be easily solved. While he was thinking about this, Beta Persei looked at Yang Qindong with a look of seeking his opinion, as if to say, "Young master, when are we going to make a move? Say something. Why are you looking at me? Just follow the plan." Yang Qindong rolled his eyes at Beta Persei and turned his head to the side. He knew that the other party was asking for his opinion. After all, according to the rules, once a military plan was formulated, even a leader like him could not casually intervene or change it. The reason why second young Master Yang was still looking at him like that was because he wanted to personally go to the battlefield. Speaking of which, this person was really wrong to be his family general. He should be leading the army to gallop on the battlefield and expand the territory. Yang Qindong did not agree to let Beta Persei follow the army. Swords had no eyes, and now there was no one more convenient by his side. He did not want to see anything happen to Beta Persei. There were many things that he had to do himself. Beta Persei, who did not get permission to fight, looked a little wronged. As a man in his 30s, he pretended to be a wronged little wife. It was difficult for the burly Beta Persei, but when he made a few consecutive actions that made him want to vomit, he found that the young master had turned around again and did not even look at him. He knew that his performance was in vain. The young master had made up his mind not to allow him to participate in the battle. He could only put away his wronged face and said to Badeo Jiang, the deputy captain of the Black Cavalry Brigade who was watching the show, "Go and pass on the young master's order. Everything will be done according to the previous plan." When Ba Daojiang saw Yang Er's darkened face, he quickly put away his sinister smile and agreed with a serious expression. Then he turned around and left. According to the military plan, a part of the new Second Army's infantry division and a part of the foreign Russian army were the first to sneak into Bulgaria. The infantry division's commander, Yang Chanfeng, was a student of the Yang Family Academy in Chilean City. He was a standard Han Chinese, but he learned Mongolian and Russian well in the academy. In the final military thesis examination, he was ranked at the top. After graduation, he went directly to the army and started as a platoon leader. Along the way, he made countless contributions and became the commander of the new Second Army's infantry division. This person was rough but meticulous, and he was proficient in 3 languages. It was reassuring to leave this kind of infiltration mission to him. The commander of the White Russian Division was given to Nikolaev. This person's qualifications and ability were naturally not enough, but he had a bitter background. He could unite most of the White Russians, and he was very loyal to Yang Qindong. The people of his tribe were all in the far east regions, all city. There was no need to worry about such people rebelling, so he was given the position of acting commander. Fortunately, Ahuli surrendered. This person had been a great Khan before, and Yang Qindong also gave him the opportunity to choose his own path. After he understood the structure and glorious history of the 5-star army, he finally decided to join the army and was directly appointed as the deputy commander. He cooperated with Nikolaev to manage the White Russian Division. With Ahuli's help, the military had been greatly supplemented, and Yang Qindong could be more at ease. The next step was to let the other party undergo the baptism of war. It would be much easier to obtain an elite army after a lot of tempering. Naturally, there would be losses in this process, and a lot of people would be eliminated like sand being washed away by waves. This was the cruelty of war. This was the only way to obtain elite soldiers. This was the reason why the merciful could not command an army. Inside the Bulgar city, Yang Chuanfeng's subordinates, Nikolaev, Ahuli, and the others had already infiltrated the city. They either pretended to be passers-by or people who came to seek refuge. There were also people dressed in ragged clothes who pretended to be refugees. They were hiding in various parts of the city, waiting to coordinate with the main army from the inside. As the largest city in the north of the Golden Horde, not only would there be white Russian merchants here, but there would also be some people from small tribes in the nearby forests who would come here to buy things. There were also people who did not have anything to eat, and those who could not survive would come here to beg. They were all called refugees. It was because of this that the population of the city was not fixed. Perhaps one day there would be more refugees, and the city's population would increase. The Mongolian soldiers who were in charge of security here were used to this. Of course, this had a lot to do with the pride and arrogance in their hearts. No matter what, this place belonged to the Golden Horde, and no one had ever tried to attack them here. Using this loophole, no matter if it was Yang Chunfeng, Nikoliv, or Ahuli, when they entered the city, they did not attract any attention. Ahuli, on the other hand, had a look of reluctance, especially when he looked at Nikoliv, who was dressed in noble clothes. He said, unhappily, "Look at you, it's a waste of good clothes on you." Ahuli looked down on Nikoliv. This was a form of racial prejudice. At that time, most Mongolians looked down on the White Russians. After all, they had suppressed them for more than 200 years. But how could Nikoliv look up to Ahuli? Hearing these complaints, Nikoliv snorted and said, "I am now the acting commander, and you are only the deputy commander. According to the rank, I am higher than you, and I have to listen to the commander's orders. Don't you know that?" Humph! This time, Ahuli did not say anything. He just snorted to show his dissatisfaction. He was willing to join the 5-star army, not because of Nikoliv. He really saw many Mongolian brothers in the 5-star army, and he heard from them that many Mongolians were living better and better under King Wunan of Damyang. As mentioned before, Ahuli was a Mongolian Khan with his own ideas. He was a leader who wanted to let the people under his rule live a better life. To achieve this goal, he had made a lot of efforts and made a lot of concessions. For example, in the original Great Crow City, there were many White Russians there, but they had never seen him bully anyone. This was proof. He had ideas and made efforts, but the effect was not good. Later, he thought about it, and it was because he was not big enough. Now, Yang Qindong was here. He had more ideas than him, and he did things better. More importantly, he was strong enough. Not only did he have a vast territory, but he was also very rich. Ahuli, who knew all this, did not mind hitching a ride. His request was very simple. He wanted the Mongolians to live a stable life and not have to worry about food. For this goal, he almost lost his life. Now, he was just one of Yang Qindong's subordinates. What was so unacceptable about it? Ahuli surrendered to Yang Qindong, not Nikoliv. Especially when he found that Nikoliv had a deep prejudice against the Mongolians, he would often talk back to him. He was venting his dissatisfaction, and also reminding Nikoliv not to be prejudiced against the Mongolians. After being a Khan for so many years, he knew when to stop. This time, after reminding Nikoliv, he did not say anything. Instead, he stared at the Mongolian general's residence across the street. He had already asked around. This was the residence of the Bulgar general. If he could control this place as soon as he made a move, then everything would be much easier. After noticing Ahuli's gaze, Nikoliv's expression became much more serious. "I say, Vice Division Commander, when we make a move, can you guarantee that you can control this place?" There was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. After all, Nikoliv was only someone from a small tribe. Although he was very brave, his experience was limited. Compared to before, when he was just a poor boy, there was too much of a difference between him and this so-called general. Where did his confidence come from? On the other hand, Ahuli's face was indifferent. He was someone who had been a Khan. What kind of situation had he not seen before? It was just a general of a city. Naturally, he would not be scared. "It's fine. When we make a move, I will be the first to rush in. You just need to bring people to guard the outside and prevent anyone from escaping." Okay. Hearing such a promise, Nikolaev nodded in relief. Although he hated the Mongols deep in his bones, if it were not for them, his tribe would not have to live such a poor life. However, he was still very confident in Ahuli's ability. Since he said so, there should not be any problems. Nikolaev, who was pretending to be a rich white Russian merchant, walked slowly on this street. From time to time, he would stop in front of some open-air stalls and ask about the price of some goods. It seemed that there was nothing wrong with it, but in fact his heart was in a mess. This was the first time he had carried out such a mission. In the past, he only thought that when two armies fought, they would pull apart their stances and compete with courage and perseverance. However, after joining the 5-Star Army, he realized that even if it was a war, there was a very special way. If he used it well, he could win with fewer people and win with the weak. Like a studious student, Nikolaev studied with all his might. It was because of this spirit and his innate affinity that he was able to become friends with many White Russians. Yang Qindong appointed him as a substitute teacher. The panicked Nikolaev forced himself to calm down. However, his panicked eyes still betrayed him. From time to time, he would look at the general's residence in the distance. At the same time, he kept asking himself, why hasn't the main force of the 5-Star Army attacked yet? As if they felt his call, the street suddenly became chaotic. Many Mongol soldiers were running towards this street. Obviously, something urgent must have happened. They were here to report. Chapter 1419. Stop them! Out of instinct, Nicholas shouted to the people on both sides of the street. Then hundreds of strong White Russian men rushed out. Unknowingly, they had sharp cavalry swords in their hands. Seeing more and more soldiers gathering around him, Nicholas couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Then he thought of Ahu. He wanted to see if Ahu had already made his move. After all, he didn't have enough people with him. They wouldn't be able to hold on for long. When he turned around, he realized that the door of the great general's residence was already wide open, and he could vaguely hear the clashing sounds of swords and sabers coming from within the residence. This meant that Ahuli had already made his move. Nicholas heaved a sigh of relief. Then he turned to the White Russian soldiers who were gathering around him and said, "Hold on, don't let anyone rush into the general's mansion." As Nicholas spoke, he took a cavalry sword from one of the soldiers. Then he charged with them towards a group of 50 Mongolian soldiers. They were now warriors, and they were no longer the rootless trees from before. Recently, they had also gone through the training of battle formations. Even though they had not fully grasped it, they still managed to cut down the 50 Mongolian cavaliers with their advantage in numbers. After a quarter of an hour, only the White Russian warriors, led by Nikolai, were left standing on the street. Clean up the battlefield. Finish off those who should be dealt with. Treat the injured soldiers immediately. Thinking about the battlefield knowledge that the soldiers of the 5-Star Army had taught him, Nicholas shouted out. After that, the soldiers started to get busy again. Screams of agony sounded out again. Those were the screams of the Mongol soldiers who hadn't died yet. Some of the soldiers took out the bandages they carried with them and wrapped them around the wounds of their injured comrades. Due to the limited conditions, they could only stop the bleeding first. After the battle, there would naturally be medical personnel from the 5-Star Army to treat them. Just as these were done, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. Nicholas looked over, and his face turned ugly. It's actually the Mongolian cavalry. There are about 80 of them. Looking at his side, there were less than 70 soldiers who could still fight with light injuries. In terms of numbers, they were already inferior to the enemy, not to mention infantry against cavalry, which was a natural disadvantage. "Master, what should we do?" A few Russian officers asked Nikolai nervously. "Don't panic. Set up obstacles. Don't let the cavalry rush over so quickly." Nicholas looked to the left and right of the street, and his gaze landed on the wooden boards of the stalls. He pretended to be calm and said, "The chaos just now had already scared away the peddlers and merchants. Many people didn't even take their goods with them because they were afraid of being implicated. After receiving the order, the White Russian soldiers immediately ran to the left and right, taking out everything that could be lifted from both sides of the road and throwing them on the road to form a simple barrier. He knew that these things wouldn't last long, but he had no other choice but to do this. Right now, he could only hope that the main force of the Five-Star Army would arrive quickly. He hoped that Ahuli would be able to deal with the general's manner quickly. At the very least, it would be much safer to hide there. The Mongolian cavaliers who came from afar had already seen the obstacles on the road and also saw the corpses of their own soldiers. Their expressions changed drastically and they became very ugly. One of the young generals said angrily, "Release the arrows! Kill these White Russian bastards!" After receiving the order, the Mongolian cavalry took out the bows on their backs and started to nock the arrows. Following this, the sound of arrows piercing through the air rang out as they flew towards the White Russian soldiers. "Find a place to hide, quick!" Nicholas shouted as he hid behind a thick wooden board. Just as he finished doing that, the arrows fell and hit the wooden board, creating a series of banging sounds. As a race that grew up on horseback, the Mongolian cavalry's archery skills were very high, and there were very few who could match them. When this wave of arrows came, many of the White Russian soldiers were hit because they didn't hide well enough. There were also some who didn't find a suitable place to hide, and the arrows still pierced through their bodies. Cries of agony rang out around him, which meant that more and more White Russian soldiers had lost their lives. Hearing this, Nikolaev bit his lips. His right hand gripped the saber so tightly that it turned white. After a few rounds of arrows, the Mongolian cavalry had arrived in front of the obstacles. Following this, the cavalry at the front dismounted and started to move the objects. There were also some bleeding corpses. "Kill!" Feeling the Mongolian cavalry's aura getting closer and closer, Nicholas looked through the gap between the cover and saw that the distance between them was less than 6 meters. He knew that this was the best time to counterattack, so he shouted and led the 30 or so White Russian soldiers who weren't injured to charge out. The sudden battle cry did not cause the Mongolian soldiers to panic. On the contrary, one of them even smiled savagely and charged at Nicholas with a machete. An instant later, the two sides clashed, and the cruel battle of life and death began. As both sides fought, the Mongolian cavalry were unable to shoot their arrows. They simply dismounted and charged over. They wanted to surround Nicholas and the others and kill them all. They did not want to let a single one of them escape. Facing the Mongolian soldiers getting closer and closer, Nicholas only turned around to look at the general's manner before giving up on the idea of entering. He did not want to be looked down on by a Ahuli, and he did not want to be a burden to him. "Soldiers, let's go all out. Our names have already been registered. Even if we die in this battle, our families and people in Bugnam of Gojozian will take care of us. Even if we die, what is there to fear?" Seeing that more than 10 of his brothers had died in the battle in a short period of time, Nicholas knew that they were doomed this time. Therefore, he simply gave up on his fantasy and roared loudly with the thought that killing one was enough to break even, and killing 2 was a win for him. After joining the 5-star army, they had to register. Even if they were just auxiliary soldiers, this way, if something happened to them, their heirs would be able to receive compensation from the 5-star army. This was a form of protection for everyone, and they would not have to worry about what happened after they died on the battlefield. In the past, when there was a war between tribes, if one died, then one's wife and children would become slaves. Now, they were people with an organization. If something happened, not only would their families be able to receive compensation, if someone dared to bully the family of a martyr, they would just have to find an official and someone would support them. It was because of these policies that no one had ever heard of or even thought about before that when Yang Qindong said that he wanted to establish a division outside of Russia, the enthusiasm of the applicants far exceeded everyone's expectations. These people were carefully selected, and those who were not in their prime were not accepted. Otherwise, not to mention 20,000 people, even an army of 50,000 could be gathered. Hearing Nikolaev shout, the remaining dozen people also had a look of determination to die. Since everything had been arranged, what else was there to worry about? They would just kill. As the saying went, the soft feared the hard feared the unreasonable, and the unreasonable feared those who did not care about their lives. When the dozen Russian soldiers became fugitives facing the Mongol soldiers who were many times their number, they no longer defended. Instead, they continuously attacked, and the momentum of the Mongol soldiers became sluggish, and they could not help but take a few steps back. Only then did they avoid the Russian soldiers. Come, isn't it just death? Who's afraid of who? Nikolaev borrowed the momentum from before to cut down 2 Mongolian soldiers. At this moment, his momentum was at its peak, and when he spoke, his voice was a bit louder. Lunatics, a bunch of lunatics. Don't waste words with them. Just shoot them to death. When the Mongol soldiers saw that Nikolaev and his men were not afraid of death and wanted to drag them down with them, they shook their heads and retreated to open up the distance between them. At the same time, they took out their bows and arrows and prepared to shoot. Seeing the Mongol soldiers take out their bows and arrows, Nikolaev was shocked and quickly tried to find cover. However, in such a short period of time, where could he hide? Just as he thought that he was going to die, a voice suddenly shouted, "Put down your weapons immediately, otherwise your general will die in front of you." The one who shouted was Ahuli. At this moment he had already walked out of the general's residence, and in his right hand he was holding the Mongol general. In that short period of time he had brought his own personal guards into the residence, and after a fierce battle he had captured the enemy general. It was only because Bulgar city had not been in a war for many years that there were less than 50 soldiers defending the residence that Ahuli was able to deal with them in such a short period of time, saving Nikolaev's life. With their general being held hostage, the faces of the Mongol soldiers turned ugly. When they saw that the saber on their general's neck was about to be pulled at any moment, they had no choice but to put down their bows. "Many thanks." Nikolaev, who was still in shock, walked to Ahuli's side and said in an unnatural manner, "If you really want to thank me, why don't you let me be your division commander?" Ahuli suddenly made a request. Nikolaev was stunned at first, but he quickly reacted and shook his head. The acting division commander is personally appointed by Bognom of Gojosian. If you have the ability, go find Bognom of Gojosian to change your military order. Humph. Don't worry. The position of division commander will be mine sooner or later, Ahuli said without a care. The two of them were still bickering, but after what happened just now, it was obvious that their relationship had become much closer. In the words of the future, they had formed a revolutionary friendship. Chapter 1420. With the Mongolian general under control, Yang Chunfeng led the 5-star army hidden in the city and took down the unguarded city gate. Without a unified command, the Mongolian army fell into chaos. Then a large number of new Second Army cavalry soldiers rushed into the city of Bulgar. From then on, the city was surnamed Yang, forever separated from the territory of the Golden Horde. By the time Yang Chindong entered the city under the protection of the Black Cavalry, the security of the city had returned to normal. With strict military rules, no soldier dared to disturb the people. When the city was taken, only the Mongolian soldiers were hurt. The city is not big, but the population is not small. Yang Chindong walked on the street, looking around casually, then shook his head gently. "Yes, I heard that Bulgar is the largest city in the north of the Golden Horde. Many people living nearby often come here to exchange for what they need." Beta Persei told Yang Chindong some of the things he learned before. It's a pity that the Mongolians seem to be used to a nomadic lifestyle. They don't know how to make use of such good conditions. Haha. But this time we are here, everything is different. Watch how I build a big city here. A sufficient population and abundant, untapped resources. All of these were boundless wealth in Yang Chindong's hands. Beta Persei naturally believed Yang Chindong's words. He nodded heavily and said flatteringly, "Of course, who is the young master? There is only one such person in the world." Yang Chindong, who was elated by this sentence, laughed and said, "Well, young heir, you're so good at complimenting people. Well, tell me, do you have something to ask of the young master?" He was in a good mood and also joked. This. Beta Persei rubbed his hands and looked at Yang Qindong with a smile and said, "Young master, it is said that the Mongolian cavalry is good at charging. If you want to fight with them this time, can you let me lead the charge?" He knew that Beta Persei wanted to lead the army. He was a person who loved to fight and kill. Yang Qindong sighed and thought about it before agreeing. "Well, if that's the case, I will arrange it for the young master when there is a chance." "Thank you, young master. Thank you, young master." Beta Persei, who got Yang Qindong's agreement, immediately smiled. He felt that he was getting older and older. He was afraid that if he wanted to go on the battlefield, the chances would only get fewer and fewer. Since that was the case, he should take advantage of his youth and strength to perform well. When he got older and had a group of children and grandchildren, he would have something to brag about. Yang Qindong didn't know what Beta Persei was thinking. As someone close to him and his own family, he would take care of him if he had the chance. Although charging on the battlefield was very dangerous, it was not enough to make him worry about Beta Persei. After all, his status was there, and there would be many people to protect him on the battlefield. What he needed to do now was to consider his next move. If taking down Bulgar was revenge on the Golden Horde for daring to attack Wu Sheng's Third Army, then destroying the entire Golden Horde was a necessary step for him to take over the world and make the Han Chinese the king of the world. Beta Persei passed down the order. All officers of the deputy division level and above should go to the general's mansion in the city for a meeting. Yang Qindong already had various ideas in his mind, and it was time for him to implement these decisions. The meeting was held in the general's mansion. Yang Qindong presided over the meeting, and he announced a series of military and city governance policies. 2 hours later, the generals received their orders and left. Then the granary in the city was opened. But unlike other places, this time they did not open the granary to release grain, but bartered with grain. To put it bluntly, it was to let the people bring all kinds of things to the general's mansion to sell, and then buy them in the form of Han coins. Then the people took these Han coins to the granary to buy grain and daily necessities. For example, refined salt, white sugar, soy sauce, and iron pots. The 5-star army also bought all kinds of things, such as scrap metal, used weapons, and the furs of the wild beasts in the mountains, as well as horses and sheep. The entire Golden Horde's territory did not lack mountains and dense forests. Before it was explored, the number of wild beasts in the mountains could be compared to a wild zoo in the future. As long as one was willing to take the risk, fighting a few tigers and black bears would not be a problem. Naturally, these furs were not worth much here, but if they were brought to the other inland provinces of Yangtze, it would be completely different. They could be sold for a high price, and it was possible to sell them for a few hundred times more than buying them. There was also a lot of rare mahogany in the mountains. The growth process of this kind of wood was slow, but it was abnormally strong. Furniture made of this wood could be sold for a sky-high price, and it just so happened that no one cared about the value of this item. So Yang Qindong did not hesitate to accept it. Using Han coins to buy mahogany was definitely a profitable thing. As for horses, cows, and sheep, there were even more. The main thing was that the Mongolian people were not willing to take them out. However, using refined salt as bait should not be a problem. As for the used weapons, they were naturally useless in the hands of the people. But after they were sent back to Chichen City, they could be used again and become good things. In short, they chose the things that the commoners thought were worthless in exchange for the things that they needed. This was a win-win situation. Ahuli had heard Yang Qindong's detailed explanation during the meeting. Then he requested to stay at the general's residence to cooperate with the purchase. When the news came out, many people responded enthusiastically. They took the items that Yang Qindong wanted and exchanged them for a large amount of Han coins, then went back to the granary to buy what they needed. Ahuli's eyes widened. He saw the enthusiasm of the people, the huddling of the people, and the support of the people. This matter was fully in charge of the sacrifice. Speaking of which, he could be considered an all-rounder in both military and civilian affairs. When you get on a horse to conquer the world, when you get off a horse to rule the world, you get off a horse to rule the world. When he saw Ahuli's excited and enlightened expression, he patted his shoulder and said, "Learn, the great Bugnam of Gojosian is omnipotent." Yes, Bugnam of Gojosian is too amazing. This move not only allowed the people to quickly accept the new currency, but also received sincere praise and support from the people. Presumably, after this incident, the people no longer want the 5-star army to leave this place. If someone insists on doing this, then they will become the common enemy of the people. Ahuli was indeed a smart person. From this incident, he was able to see deeper things. Hearing this, Ahuli kept nodding. Then, when he looked to the south, he was already thinking that Yang Qindong would not have a problem conquering the Golden Horde. The question was how long it would take. At first, he was still not confident that he could defeat the Golden Horde and the Rossi principalities with only a few 100,000 soldiers. But now he knew that once he won the hearts of the people, he could get as many soldiers as he wanted. In the past, he always heard Yang Qindong say that the people were the foundation, and the people were the foundation. He also knew this principle, including the saying that water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize a boat. This was the principle of the ancient sages. But why did so many people say that only Yang Qindong could do it? Shibi had thought about this before and finally came to a conclusion. That was, other people were just saying these words. The so-called people in their eyes were the upper-class people with the right to speak, especially the landowning households and the noble families. In Yang Qindong's eyes, the people were the real people. They were the lowest class of people. They were the people who were called lowly and could be sacrificed at any time. They were the people who were looked down upon by others. It might seem that Yang Qindong was wrong, but in reality, the people at the bottom were the most common. Without them, there would be no one to farm, no one to do business, and no one to create things. The so-called high and mighty people were not far from starving and freezing to death. To borrow teacher Guo's words, this was the difference between vulgarity and elegance. Elegance could not be separated from vulgarity, but vulgarity could be separated from elegance. Bulgar City, because of a series of measures, became lively again. On the streets, people could be seen taking their things to the general's mansion to exchange for Chinese currency. Then, they took the Chinese currency to the granary to buy rice, salt, sugar, soy sauce, and iron pots. Especially when the courageous commoners had already bought the goods they needed with Chinese currency and walked proudly on the streets, the decree became a reality. More and more commoners were moved and started to take action. But the people here were too poor. There were still many people who were poor and had nothing. What could they do? It was simple. They could sell their labor to earn money. For example, they could become soldiers. As long as one signed up and passed the 5-star Army's test, they would become a glorious member of the 5-star Army. At the same time, they would be able to receive a monthly salary. Furthermore, they would be able to provide for 3 or 4 people in an ordinary family. Even if they couldn't provide for 8 or 10 people, they could at least provide for 3 or 4 people in an ordinary family. Men who were past the age could choose to work to earn money. Bulgar City was still too small. Yang Qindong was preparing to expand the city. This required manpower. Also, transporting all kinds of military supplies required labor. This was a lack of work. It was the same for women. They could weave and wash clothes for the soldiers. There were also some young women who did not have any attachments. They could go and work for the army. On this point, Yang Qindong was open to the foreign races. Apart from the fact that he could not force the women to work for the army and that there could not be any Han women, if the foreign race women were willing, he would not oppose it. The soldiers worked hard on the expedition. Every day, other than rushing, training, and fighting, there was nothing else to do. In addition, when they first came here, even the female soldiers of the propaganda team did not follow them. Their days were incomparably boring. It was necessary for them to relax their minds and bodies. Otherwise, it would be easy for problems to arise. Chapter 14:21. Just like that, the 5-star army was formed. Furthermore, the treatment of the soldiers of the 5-star army was not low, and money was easy to earn. The only condition was that these women had to be healthy, and they had to be able to withstand investigation. If they were spies sent by the enemy, they would be killed as soon as they were discovered. They would not be soft-hearted. In short, after Yang Qindong became the ruler of Bulgar, it was as if the sky had changed. The people had more choices, and there were more varieties and colors of food on their tables. Not long after, more and more logistics teams arrived in Bulgar. More and more goods appeared in the city, dazzling the eyes of the foreign races. Right now, they could only hate the fact that they did not have enough Chinese currency and could not buy everything they wanted. The transport team came and went in batches. When they came, they brought all kinds of supplies and rations. When they left, they brought with them all kinds of animal hides, scrap metal, and carriages of mahogany. Once these things were transported back to Crimson City, it would not take long for their value to increase by tens of times. At the very least, it would be enough to cover the expenses of the people and horses. In the past few years, potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, and other high-yield crops were discovered. What Yangtze did not lack the least was food. The granaries of the various provinces were almost filled to the brim. Now that they could use food to exchange for the rare hides of the Central Plains, it could be considered a form of income. Not to mention the furniture made of mahogany. When brought back to Crimson City, they would be in high demand. They would not worry about not being able to sell them, but they would worry about not having enough. This was equivalent to using the money from trade to fight a war. This was also a manifestation of how knowledge could change one's fate. While others were still worrying about the cost of fighting a war, Yang Qindong could already make a fortune through fighting a war. With enough money and food, he would naturally have the confidence to fight a war. With money and rewards, the soldiers would want to perform meritorious deeds. This was a kind of virtuous cycle. How could it not be powerful? Just like when Yang Qindong was winning the hearts of the people and making money in Bulgar City, the new Second Army, under the leadership of several division commanders, had already begun to expand their territory. Before anyone knew that they had arrived, they had launched continuous attacks on cities and territories. Setting out from Bulgar City, they headed south. Within 2 months, they had taken down Kot City, Kilo City, and Kazan City, all the way to Samara City. Samara was the entrance to Sarai City, the capital of the Golden Horde. In other words, once this place was conquered, the safety of the Golden Horde's capital would be directly threatened. This was something that Great Khan Mahama would never allow to happen. It was only a month ago that Mahama, who had escaped from Kot City, found out about the fall of Bulgar City. The furious Mahama couldn't understand why the 5-star army's reinforcements had come so quickly, nor why they had the guts to cause trouble for the Golden Horde. Speaking of which, Mahama was a very domineering person, ever since he became the 39th monarch of the Golden Horde. Although the strength of the Rossi Duchy was slowly rising, he had always been in a position to suppress them. In history, when the Rossi Duchy became independent, this great Khan had already passed away many years ago. Of course, the main reason why the Rossi Duchy became independent was because the Golden Horde had begun to split, which gave them an opportunity to take advantage of. Perhaps because of his experience, Mahama was a very conceited person. He had always been the one bullying others. Since, when did others have the chance to find trouble with him? After learning about this, he first reprimanded his generals for their incompetence. How could they not have received the news that such an important city like Bulgar City had been lost? At the same time, he hurriedly mobilized all the troops stationed at the border of the Rossi Duchy from the west to the north. He wanted to take care of the 5-star army first and let them know who was the real king in this realm. This time, Mahama ordered his general, Gray, to lead 50,000 elite cavalrymen to Samara City and make preparations for the 5-star army's arrival. Mahama and his generals had already analyzed the situation. As an outsider, the King Wunan of Daimyeon would not be able to fight a protracted battle with them. Just the cold winter temperature alone was not something they could handle. Therefore, the other party would definitely think of a way to end the battle quickly. Since that was the case, all they had to do was wait for the other party to arrive. The terrain outside Kazan City was wide and suitable for a cavalry charge. When the time came, he would let this outsider know that the so-called Great Ming Dynasty was just a two-legged sheep after so many years. As the descendants of Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde did not lack elite cavalrymen. They were good at war and came and went like the wind, giving people a headache. Even the Rossi Duchy, which had a certain number of firearms, had a headache. Speaking of the Rossi Duchy, after Ivan's army was defeated in Tov City, he returned to Moscow unwillingly. Not long after he entered the city, he received news that after Wu Sheng's Third Army and the 5-star Army's reinforcements met up, they left the destroyed Tov City and headed for Oxino City, occupying it. While they were recuperating, they were like a tiger watching a nail over the Rossi Duchy. As the saying goes, how could one allow others to sleep beside one's bed? The 5-star Army's actions were seen as a threat and a provocation by the Rossi people. Not long after Ivan entered the city, he received news that his father-in-law was going to send troops to eliminate the 5-star Army. At the very least, they were going to be chased out. With regards to his father-in-law's decision, Ivan raised both his hands in approval. Especially after fighting a battle with them and witnessing their abilities, he was even more convinced. In his eyes, the 5-star Army was an existence that was on par with the Golden Horde. In the main hall, when Ivan arrived, all his generals were already standing there. They were listening to Vanya's report on the Battle of Tov City. Vanya knew the importance of this matter, so he did not exaggerate or exaggerate. Instead, he reported the entire battle truthfully. At the end of his report, he even said, "I don't think there was anything wrong with our command in this battle. I can only say that the 5-star Army's cavalry was too strong. The 5-star Army's ability was even stronger than the elite cavalry of the Golden Horde. They were not even afraid of the rumbling of cannons. They were a terrifying opponent, stronger than the cavalry of the Golden Horde." After these words were spoken, many people in the imperial court chuckled. It was no wonder that they thought so. The Golden Horde was one of the purest descendants of the Mongol army. Many of their cavalry started practicing archery when they first learned how to walk. Who could possibly be their opponent? In the face of such mocking laughter, Vanya did not respond. On the contrary, he maintained his silence. This was his way of protecting himself. The reason why he was not a direct descendant of the Grand Duke of Blindness, but still had his own position in the court and others could not do anything to him, was because of this caution and carefulness. After all, he had already spoken the truth. As for whether they believed it or not, it had nothing to do with him. Seeing that Vanya did not respond, Ivan, who had just arrived, was not happy. His face darkened as he said, "Everyone, there is nothing funny about this. The strength of the 5-star Army's cavalry will only be beyond your imagination." Ha ha ha. It would have been better if Ivan did not speak. His words caused even more laughter. What's going on? The smart Ivan sensed that something was wrong. He also did not know that when the news of his defeat came, Tugnev of the Vyaka city said in the court that their young master would definitely exaggerate the strength of the 5-star Army's reinforcements to reduce his own guilt. At that time, many people heard it. Now that Ivan said it like this, wasn't it a confirmation of his words? Everyone recalled Tugnev's words. No wonder they laughed so loudly. The blind Grand Duke was also present that day. He also heard what Ivan said. When he saw his son, Ivan, jump out, his expression was not good. "Ivan, it's good that you're back. This battle has been hard on you. Go back and have a good rest." This was telling him that he would not be needed in the upcoming battle against the 5-star Army. How could Ivan be willing to let this go? He immediately wanted to refute loudly, "Father-in-law, your son. Enough, this is an order, not a discussion." The blind Grand Duke displayed the dignity that a person in his position should have. Then he ignored Ivan and asked the ministers, "Oxino City is our territory. Our citizens are there. We must take it back. Who is willing to lead troops to complete this extermination mission?" Tugnev, who had long wanted to show off his skills, was waiting for these words. He immediately stepped out and said, "This general is willing." Speaking of which, Oxino City was actually one of Tugnev's areas of influence. If there was trouble there, as the true master, he definitely could not stand by and do nothing. The court meeting ended. Ivan was left behind to meet with his father alone. When there was no one else around, Ivan looked at his father with an unconvinced expression. He believed that his wise father-in-law would definitely give him a reason. "Are you unconvinced?" Although his vision was limited, especially in his left eye, the Grand Duke of Blindness could still sense Ivan's dissatisfaction. Ifan didn't hold back. He was indeed very emotional. "Father-in-law, what your son said is true. This 5-star army cavalry is very strong. If we don't pay attention to them, our army will definitely be at a disadvantage." "Father-in-law believes what you said." Before Ivan could continue, the blind Grand Duke had already concluded. This time, Ivan was at a loss for what to do. Fortunately, the blind Grand Duke continued speaking. "Since you are so sure, what is there to worry about? Some people will definitely hit a nail on the head. Some people will definitely look down on their opponents. Since that is the case, why not let them suffer some losses? Whether it is the 5-star army's defeat or Tugnev's defeat, it is not a bad thing for our duchy, is it not?" Chapter 1422. At this moment, Ivan suddenly realized that his father-in-law wanted to use the 5-star army to wear down Turgenev's strength. "Sai, you should know that your father-in-law has been painstakingly managing the Rossi principalities all these years, but not everyone supports our actions. For example, Maxim, Turgenev, and Vanya are the representatives. They have their own territories, their own forces, and even their own armies. They also have a group of nobles who are dissatisfied with us, supporting them. Unless there is a legitimate reason, we can't do anything to them. If that's the case, why don't we let them fight the 5-star army? Just as you said, the opponent is very strong. Let them fight it out among themselves. When the time comes, whoever wins or loses will be beneficial to us." This was the Duke's plan. Ivan finally understood and was in a good mood. "Father-in-law, I was wrong." Seeing that his son understood his father's decision so quickly, the blind Duke was also very happy. But then he asked worriedly, "Is the 5-star army's cavalry really that strong? Turgenev won't defeat them, right?" "Absolutely not. If we are cautious, we might be able to use a large number of cannons and double the number of soldiers. But with Turgenev's arrogance, we will definitely lose," Ivan said with an incomparably resolute tone. As for Turgenev, after receiving the military order in the court, he returned to his residence in high spirits and began to mobilize his troops. He didn't believe Ivan's words. As for Vanya, although he was also on their side, he had always been timid and cautious. His words were also not trustworthy. This time he wanted to teach the 5-star army a lesson and let them know who was the real strong on the battlefield. He wasn't the only one who thought so. The nobles who supported Turgenev also had the same opinion. Although they didn't have much contact with the Han army, they had fought with the Golden Horde for more than 200 years. From their words, it was clear who was stronger between the White Russians and the Han army. The Han people were called two-legged sheep by the Golden Horde. According to them, when faced with the attack of the Mongol cavalry, the Han people either fled or surrendered. They didn't even have the courage to resist. In comparison, the White Russians were much more courageous. Didn't this prove that they were stronger than the Han army? With the support of the nobles, provisions were naturally no longer a problem. Turgenev took his own 80,000 soldiers and the 20,000 soldiers he got from the Grand Duke of the Blind. A total of 100,000 people, 100 cannons, and 10,000 muskets to the north. In Kazan City, Yang Qindong arrived at the city under the protection of the Black Cavalry. Behind him, not only had Bulgar been liberated, and a large amount of trade had begun. Even Khat City and Kilo City, which had been taken down, had also begun to reform. The people of the Golden Horde, who had always relied on the heavens for food, didn't know that there were so many good things in the world. Moreover, they didn't need to fight or risk their lives. As long as they worked hard, they could obtain all of this. With food and water and the hope of a better life, the three cities were quickly stabilized, and more Mongolian citizens were willing to work for them. Regardless of whether it was building the city, reclaiming the land, building roads, or mining, they were all very enthusiastic. Just like what Yang Qindong said before, these people had been suffering for too long. Now, as long as they put in some effort, no one would be stupid enough to go against the 5-star army. In the face of a bright future, the so-called ethnic background was worthless. If they didn't study, they wouldn't have the wisdom of the people. These people also had their own advantages. It was very simple to distinguish right from wrong. They would help whoever was good to them. As for ethnic background, the barbarians didn't care too much about it. Of course, there were some troublemakers among them. Yang Qindong didn't show any mercy to these people. He killed those who needed to be killed and captured those who needed to be captured. After purposefully removing the troublemakers, the rest of the Mongol people became very obedient. They also received a lot of benefits, and their living conditions improved. Now, many Mongol people were worried about how long this kind of life could last. After all, the land they occupied was the territory of the Golden Horde. If the Great Khan brought his army over, would the Han army be able to withstand it? Yang Qindong didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this kind of worry. However, this was a good thing. In order to solve the worries and doubts in everyone's hearts, Yang Qindong personally came to Kazan City and went to the front line. He used his actions to tell those who had doubts in their hearts that he was at the front line. If there was any danger, it would be directed at him. Everyone could rest assured and develop in peace. They could work hard to support their families and strive for a better life. As soon as he arrived at Kazan City, a telegram came from Chichen City. It could be said that there was good news one after another. After the first successful steam engine, the field artillery was also successfully produced in batches. This had entered the final stage of development before Yang Qindong left. Now, all kinds of difficulties had been overcome, and it was successfully produced. The credit for this was also due to the efforts of the first city. Yumian and Tigers, Ming fully implemented his ideas. After the first city was completely stabilized, a large number of mining operations began. For a time, a lot of iron, copper, molybdenum, coal, zinc, gold, lead, and tungsten were developed and transported to Chichen City through the 3 eastern provinces. With sufficient raw materials, all kinds of experiments took a big step forward, and the success rate began to increase. After ruling Crimson City for more than a decade, Yang Qindong had invested a huge sum of money into it. Now that he was finally reaping the rewards, Yang Qindong could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. The emergence of all kinds of advanced products meant that Yang Xie had taken a key step from light industry to heavy industry. The world was still dominated by cold weapons, and firearms were just in a budding state. Yang Xie's various scientific research results were undoubtedly the most advanced among them. What was there to be afraid of? Just like the field artillery, it was named by Yang Qindong, but it first appeared in history in 1897. A French artillery research team formed by General Douiville, Colonel Debord, and Captain Romeo invented the 75mm field artillery. This was the world's first modern cannon in history. The 75mm field artillery was developed according to the patent of the German Hausen. It used the long recoil principle, but Germany refused to use long recoil cannons. This kind of field artillery had a powerful power. The 75mm cannon was the first field artillery that completely solved the recoil problem. The cannon body could be slid on a cradle through a guide wheel. The cradle was mounted on the cannon frame, and the cannon frame was connected to the piston rod in the cylinder. When the cannon was recoiled, the piston would compress the hydraulic oil, and a portion of the hydraulic oil would enter the chamber through a small valve to compress the air. When the cannon reached the end of the recoil, the compressed air would return to its original position. This was the main reason why the 75mm field artillery was so good. Now, Yang Qindong was the first to have it. This was the first time other than Daikra that a large cannon had been successfully created. Compared to Daikra's cannon, which required all kinds of excuses to be taken out, the appearance of the field artillery was undoubtedly a very important step forward. Although this type of cannon could only fire iron bullets, it was created through his own hard work. It was also a big step forward. Send a message to the Qiqian City Munitions Factory to continue to develop explosive bullets based on the original iron bullets. Send a message to City Lord Yu Qian to coordinate with the relevant departments and find a way to move a portion of the munitions factory to the city and build it nearby. Send a message to Tigers Mane and Yangtze to keep a close eye on the munitions factory, especially to prevent spies from entering. If the technology is leaked, they will be killed. Also, send a message to the governor of the 3 eastern provinces, Lu Ji and General Yi Ligong. Tell them to do their best to transport the field artillery and send a batch to us as soon as possible. Yang Qindong, who gave a series of orders, wiped his fists. He couldn't wait to see the field artillery that could shoot up to 6 miles away in his hands, and the moment it showed its power on the battlefield. After dealing with these matters, the reform of Kazan City began. With the experience of the previous 3 cities, everything was carried out in an orderly manner. Other than a portion of the army, the rest of the army was ready to go all out against the Golden Horde's army. Originally, Yang Qindong wanted to use the 100mm mortar in Daikra to attack Salai City and directly threaten the Golden Horde Xinjing. But after receiving the news of the field artillery, he decided to wait. If he could use the artillery to deal with the enemy, why would he need the soldiers to fight on the battlefield? So after arriving at Kazan City, he stopped here and did not move forward. He only waited for the artillery to arrive before carrying out the next step of the military operation. And now, what he needed to do most was to prepare for the winter. Yes, although it was only the beginning of July and the weather was very hot, it was still necessary to prepare for the winter. This was due to the climate in Eastern Europe. Winter alone lasted for half a year, which was one of the main reasons for the poverty here. Without enough time to do what needed to be done, it was indeed difficult to develop. In order to live well in the winter, a source of fire was indispensable, and warm clothes were also indispensable. Yang Qindong had already started to prepare for these. A large number of cotton-padded clothes and high-grade down jackets were made by the Qiqian City clothing factory and sent here. Some of the coal mines near Bulgar City were also located by Yang Qindong and were being mined. There were also some coal furnaces built by the ironware factory in Qiqian City that were being transported. Even some greenhouses were being built so that there would be enough sparse vegetables in the winter. Chapter 14:23. Yang Qindong was doing everything he could think of to prepare for winter. He wanted to use his actions to show everyone that the winter here was not difficult. As long as they were prepared enough, it was possible to make the outside cold and the inside warm. As long as they got used to living here, the fertile black soil was a treasure. They could grow all sorts of crops with higher yields and better food. Yang Qindong did not move forward after arriving at Kazan City. This scene was seen by the Golden Horde, and they were very confused. They did not understand why the 2-legged sheep were not moving forward. Were they afraid, or did they know that they were prepared to teach them a lesson in front of Samara, and did not dare to come? All right, since you're not coming, we'll go, right? General Gray decided to give up on defending and take the initiative to attack. For this reason, he mobilized the army to find 30,000 White Russians and captured them to serve the army. Capturing slaves to charge into the army was a tradition of the Mongolian cavalry. Usually, the slaves could be used to transport military supplies for them, and in battle they could be used to charge at the front and attract the enemy's arrows and guns. In a chaotic world, human lives were cheap. The Mongolian cavalry had never treated the White Russians as human lives. The moment he set out, the scouts reported back. This made Yang Qindong, who was prepared to defend the city, see an opportunity. He decided to change his strategy of only defending the city. Nothing in the world was difficult for those who set their minds to it. Many things had two sides to them. One side was good, and the other side was bad. It was just that most people could not see it. If it was only the Mongolian cavalry, Yang Qindong decided to defend with the city walls and not attack them. He would just let them attack and deplete their strength. But there were 30,000 White Russians among them. That was a completely different story. Yang Qindong's next big move was all about manpower. These 30,000 people were right in front of him. How could he not take them? Not only that, but after considering the cost, he decided to take all 50,000 Mongolian cavalry. This way, the lack of manpower would be greatly reduced. Yang Qindong summoned a group of high-ranking officers and gave them orders one by one. Xiao Feng, the commander of Cold Front's 2nd Division, who had just arrived, looked very excited. As one of the first officers to follow Yang Qindong, Xiao Feng had been holding his breath all these years. It seemed like the 6th young master trusted him and handed over the security of Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and other provinces to him. Usually, he only needed to lead the elite Cold Front to travel between these provinces and show his head from time to time to intimidate some people. It might seem like a lot of work, but in reality, letting the most elite Cold Front do this was like using a butcher's knife to kill a chicken, especially when he saw the other brotherly armies, and even many of the armies that were established later on, starting to gain merit one after another. Xiao Feng had requested for more than one battle from the army headquarters. He had even requested for a battle from Yang Qindong, but because of work reasons he had not been transferred. 10 years passed just like that. Vietnam and the other provinces had completely stabilized. The people who moved here from other places had already gotten used to the way of life and social order here. The only thing left for Cold Front's 2nd Division to do was to train and train. Just as many aspiring soldiers were complaining endlessly, and many of them even began to request for transfer, Yang Qindong's telegram finally arrived. He still remembered that day. Xiao Feng's face was covered in tears as he knelt on the ground emotionally. After receiving Yang Qindong's orders, Cold Front's 2nd Division did not delay at all, other than not being able to do anything on the ship. Once they arrived on land, they rushed to Eastern Europe as fast as they could. They were afraid that Yang Qindong would change his mind at night and that they would not be able to make it in time for the big battle. Just like that, 20 days in advance, Cold Front's 2nd Division reported to Yang Qindong and was fortunate enough to make it in time for the big battle. In the military meeting just now, according to Yang Qindong's military plan, Cold Front's 2nd Division was clearly the main force. Although it seemed like they were under a lot of pressure, Xiao Feng did not even frown. The harder the mission, the more it proved the ability of Cold Front's 2nd Division. The 5-star army was waiting in formation. The Mongol cavalry did not rush and appeared in Kazan City 7 days later. This did not mean that they did not want to move faster. It was just that the 30,000 White Russian slaves seemed to know their fate. They walked extremely slowly, as if they were being chased. They walked for over 200 miles in 7 days. Using these 7 days, the 5-star army had made all sorts of preparations for the big battle. Now, they were just waiting for the prey to appear so that they could reel in the net. Gray did not know about all this. He was still fantasizing about defeating these 2-legged sheep and waiting for the Khan's praise and rewards when he returned. 8 miles below Kazan City, there was a relatively wide open space that could accommodate tens of thousands of cavalry. This was the place that Gray had set up camp for the army. Although it was a little far from the city gate, he had brought all the cavalry. As long as the siege went smoothly, it would not affect the cavalry's final charge. After choosing the camp, Gray ordered the army to take the time to rest. He wanted to attack Kazan City the next morning. He wanted to end the battle quickly. He wanted to tell everyone that two-legged sheep were still two-legged sheep. No matter how strong they were still sheep in front of wolves. The Mongol army settled down and quickly fell asleep. However, the 5-star army did not rest. They had already slept during the day. To them, it was time to work at night. Using the moonlight, the 5-star army soldiers continuously exited the city and formed a huge encirclement around the Mongol cavalry camp 8 miles away. Yang Qindong did not have the intention to launch a night attack. From his point of view, they could still win if they did so. However, the price they had to pay would be too high and the rewards would be too little. This was not what he wanted. What he wanted was a complete victory and not just defeating the enemy. At the Mongol army's camp, there were already scouts who had discovered the actions of the 5-star army. They quickly reported it to General Gray, who had just laid down. He was so shocked that he broke out in a cold sweat. At the same time, he asked his subordinates, "Are the barricades and other items prepared?" "General, don't worry. Everything has been arranged. If the 5-star army doesn't come, then forget it. If they come, we will teach them how to behave." The general in charge of night duty said arrogantly, "Very good. However, we cannot be careless. How about this? Transfer another 10,000 cavalry over and let them defend with you. If the 5-star army sneaks into the camp, then fight them back. Of course, if they don't sneak into the camp, don't act rashly. After all, it's already dark. If we attack rashly, it's easy to fall into their trap." Although Gray was conceited, he still had a cautious side to him when it came to fighting a real battle. Yes, the Mongol general placed his right hand in front of his chest and bowed before turning around to make arrangements. Gray, who was left behind, was unable to fall asleep. Instead, he laid on the bed with his clothes on. As long as there was any movement, he would be able to jump up and command the army. As he waited anxiously, the night passed. Nothing happened. Gray didn't know when he had fallen asleep. When he opened his eyes again, the sky was already bright. He suddenly thought of something and hurriedly went out of the tent. When he saw that the army outside the tent was normal and the soldiers were preparing breakfast, he couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. It seemed like he was not sleeping too deeply. Instead, there was really no battle. Why did the 5-star army leave the city in the middle of the night? The answer was quickly revealed. Just as the 30,000 white Russian slaves and 50,000 Mongol cavalrymen were eating breakfast and preparing for the big battle, soldiers started to appear around their camp. There were infantry, cavalry, Han Chinese, Mongols, White Russians, and warriors from some unknown ethnic groups. After a rough calculation, other than the road to Kazan City in the north, there were at least 20,000 soldiers on each of the other 3 sides. In total, there were 60,000 soldiers surrounding them. Ha 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 ha. After Gray received the accurate information, he could not help but laugh out loud. 60,000 soldiers surrounding his 80,000 soldiers. What was the Han army doing? Was this a joke? Did they not know that there was no way to hide the truth? Come, send out 5,000 cavalrymen to attack the right side. I want to see who in the world can be our opponent. Gray said with a face of confidence. The generals under him immediately obeyed. A group of 5,000 Mongol cavalrymen left the main camp and started to gather on the right side of the army. The 5-star army on the right side had roughly 20,000 men. They were made up of the 2 regiments of the new 2nd Army, the 3 battalions of the 2nd Cold Front Division, 1,200 men, and the White Russian Division, 15,000 of which were cavalry and 10,000 of which were infantry. After taking down the 4 cities of Kazan, the White Russian Division's numbers had grown. They had gone from 20,000 men to 60,000 now, although their fighting strength had not been fully formed, and they had not been tested by war. When they all stood out, they gave off a strong aura. The one in charge of the safety of the right side was the 2nd Regiment commander of the 2nd Cold Front Division, Zhong Guangquan. When he saw the Mongol army gathering their troops and charging towards them, a smile appeared on his face. "Haha, good timing, good timing. Come, Cold Front Division soldiers, get ready to shoot. New 2nd Army Cavalry, get ready to charge. White Russians, get ready to clean up the battlefield." Knowing what his mission was, Zhong Guangquan laughed out loud as he made arrangements for his troops, after which he personally walked in front of a light machine gun and got into a shooting position. Trap was the tactic that Yang Qindong had prepared for the Mongol cavalry. Relying on the advantage of the Cold Front Division's firepower, they would surround the 80,000 soldiers until they surrendered. With that, they would be able to capture many strong laborers. This would be extremely important for Yang Qindong's plans. Chapter 1424. How would the Mongol cavalry know about this? They only knew that their enemies were a bunch of mobs. Their uniforms were not uniform. In fact, it was rare for an army to unify their uniforms. However, why were there so many different races? There were also the White Russian and Mongol soldiers. Although they were holding swords, their arms were trembling. They were clearly a bunch of untrained commoners who had never seen life and death. Could they really fight with these people? As the elite cavalry of the Golden Horde, these 5,000 Mongol cavalry had their own pride. When they found out that their opponents were so weak, they were filled with arrogance. In their eyes, they only needed one charge to break the morale of their opponents. Then, all that was left was to jump on their horses and slaughter them. One by one, the Mongolian cavalrymen laughed out loud and got on their horses. They got into formation and were ready for an assault. On the other hand, the 5-star army camp, just as the Mongol soldiers thought, many of the sword-wielding soldiers were trembling. They were just commoners a few days ago. However, because the 5-star army gave them good treatment, they joined with the mindset of taking advantage of the situation. Some of them were so hungry that they could not take it anymore. When they found out that becoming a member of the 5-star army meant that they could eat and fill their stomachs, why would they care about anything else? The world was big, but the stomach was the biggest. As such, the recruitment process for the 5-star army was very simple. Very quickly, 60,000 people were gathered. In the following few days of military training, the soldiers of the new 2nd Army finally understood what it meant to be infuriated when compared to others, what it meant to be a bunch of mobs, and what it meant to be unteachable. Not to mention other things, just the fact that these new soldiers could not even tell left from right. When they walked in formation, there were all sorts of postures. There were even a few who walked with crutches. If they could not even understand the basics of walking, how could they win the battle? Because of this, many officers had reported the situation to their superiors. In the end, when it was reported to Yang Qindong, it was like a stone sinking into the ocean. Now these so-called unqualified soldiers had walked onto the battlefield. Looking at their performance, they were already scared out of their wits. If a fight really broke out, what would be the result? Would they be defeated before they could even meet the enemy? Although they were worried, the order was given by Yang Qindong. No matter how dissatisfied the selected instructors of the new 2nd Army were, they could only suppress it for now. Whether it was in Yangtze or the 5-star Army, Yang Qindong's position had never been shaken, and no one could question his words. The instructors who trained them did not understand. Even the acting division commander of the White Russian Army, Nikolov, and the deputy division commander, Ahuli, could not understand. In their eyes, such unqualified soldiers should not be on the battlefield. However, there were also people who understood, such as the Cold Blade warriors. As Yang Qindong's earliest trainees, many of them had learned from him. They even slept together, ate together, and trained together. They were really inseparable and that was why the Cold Blade Warriors were so strong and loyal. Even now, the selection of the Cold Blade Warriors was extremely strict. Not only did they have to go through strict background checks from the previous 5 generations, but they also had to see if they could endure hardships and if they really had the strength. As for the Han Chinese standards, there was no need to mention them. This was the most basic. Of course, the treatment of the Cold Blade Warriors was not something that other armies could compare to. Because of that, while Yang Qindong trusted them, the Cold Blade Warriors also trusted Yang Qindong. As long as it was a decision made by the 6th young master, they would follow it wholeheartedly. Even if he asked them to climb a mountain of swords or dive into a sea of fire, they would not frown. Just like now, seeing that the Mongolian cavalry was about to attack, the other people were still nervous. Even the White Russian recruits were not confident, but these cold vanguard warriors did not even think about this problem. Their thoughts were very simple, and that was to destroy the enemy. Hurt them so that they would tremble when they heard their names and lose their will to fight. On the battlefield, the 5,000 Mongol cavalry who were ready finally moved. Facing the encirclement formed by the 5-star soldiers, 5 li away, they launched an assault. A total of 5,000 cavalrymen formed a fan shape as they charged forward in a long snake formation. Their shouts and cries rang out incessantly. The Mongol cavalry loved to shout when charging. It was as if they did not shout, they would not be able to show off their strength. Often, such shouts could scare the enemy and cause their morale to drop by 30%. White Russian soldiers, take out your bows and get ready. One of the new Second Army's commanders yelled, following which the 8,000 White Russian archers raised their weapons and began to knock their arrows. Speaking of which, these archers were not up to standard. They had only trained for less than 7 days. Although some of them had come into contact with things when they were young, there were only a few of them. Most of them could only shoot arrows. As for hitting the target, that was not a joke. Although the number of 8,000 soldiers was not small, no one knew how much of a threat and lethality they could pose. Just when everyone was looking at this scene worriedly, Nicholas and Ari, who were standing on the top floor of Kazan City, were looking at these recruits with a pair of binoculars. Suddenly, many of the recruits released their arrows without listening to orders. Moreover, the distance of the arrows was very close. Some of them simply threw the arrows 5 or 6 meters away. Uft! Beta Persei, who was looking at this scene through his binoculars, could not hold his breath and spat it out. Then he felt that this was not good, so he quickly lowered his head and suppressed his laughter. How is this the performance of an army? Nikolov and Ahuli lowered their heads, wishing that there was a hole in the ground for them to crawl into. These were their soldiers. Although they were not personally trained by them, this kind of performance still made them feel ashamed. On the city tower, many people who saw this scene could not help but laugh, including Yang Qindong. However, he was not mocking them. He just felt amused. Then, when everyone was laughing, he said, "There will be a first time for everyone, but this kind of thing will not happen again in the future." Naturally, no one doubted Yang Qindong's words. But it did not stop some people from thinking otherwise. Many people even thought that after this battle, these recruits would probably die, so there was no need to talk about the future. In this way, the 6th young master was right. They did not know that the reason Yang Qindong said this was because of his confidence in the soldiers of the Cold Front Army. And after these White Russian recruits experienced such a humiliating scene, they would definitely work hard and continuously improve their abilities after experiencing a bloody and fiery battle. This way, after training hard, they wouldn't have such a useless performance. It was unknown if everyone understood Yang Qindong's thoughts, but now everyone's eyes were on the battlefield. They watched as the Mongolian cavalry got closer and closer to the 5-star army on the right. They were less than a mile away. At this distance, many of the Mongolian cavalry laughed. If the 5-star army did not move, they would not have the chance to move. Many of the Cold Front Army laughed. At this distance, It was too late for their opponents to escape. Next, it was time for them to perform. Commander Zhong Guangquan had been a little impatient for a long time, and his eyes became brighter. His right index finger had already touched the trigger, and he fired. At the same time he touched the trigger, a bullet shot out from the muzzle, and it went straight for a young Mongolian cavalier who was dressed in armor. Following the sound of the gunshot, the young general, who had his eyes wide open with excitement on his face, felt a pain in his chest. It was as if his entire body was fixed in place. Following that, he lost consciousness. His entire body was powerless as he fell from the horse. The sound of gunfire was an order. The regiment commander took the lead and fired the first shot. The 3 battalions, a total of 1,200 soldiers, did not hold back. They raised their guns and fired in unison. Originally, they were all aiming at their targets. Now they were happily harvesting lives, displaying their powerful side. The Cold Front Army had the 95 style in their hands, so they could fire in bursts or in bursts. 1,200 people against 5,000 people. It seemed like there was a huge difference in numbers, but in reality it was just 1 against 4. This was not a big deal. Compared to the 2,000 black cavalry taking care of the 100,000 Baiming Liaodong iron cavalry, this paled in comparison. Gunshots rang out, and according to the commander's rules, a soldier could only fire 5 shots. No matter what the result was, they could not fire anymore. The meat that they ate, they had to leave the soup for their brothers, right? With each person firing 5 shots, that was 6,000 bullets. It was inevitable that some of them would miss, and some of them would be hit by 2 bullets. After the gunshots, not all of the Mongol cavalry were wiped out. At the very least, there were less than 1,000 Mongol cavalry standing there. However, they were no longer charging forward. Instead, they were either standing there in a daze or turning their horses around to escape. After 10 years of training, not everyone in the Cold Front Army was a sharpshooter, but there were many who could hit the 48th circle with 5 bullets. Since these enemies had fearlessly charged right in front of them, there was no way they would be courteous to them. With each person firing 5 bullets, the results obtained were indeed not bad. More importantly, after this round of shooting, it also shattered the confidence of the Mongolian cavaliers to charge forward, causing them to feel fear as if they had met the devil, and they lost their will to fight. New Second Army, charge forward to eliminate the enemy. White Russian Division, charge forward to clean up the battlefield. Be quick. The Cold Front Army will be in charge of keeping watch. Captain Zhong Guangquan also only fired 5 bullets. Although he was holding a light machine gun, it was just a precaution. Now that he saw that the opponent was not going to be easy, he would not casually waste bullets and take the lead to break the rules. Chapter 1425. The 4,000 cavalrymen of the new Second Army, who had been waiting impatiently for a long time, dashed out like arrows leaving the bowstring after receiving the military order. Following closely behind were 15,000 White Russian recruits. Although they didn't have much combat experience and their military qualities weren't up to par, they were still capable of cleaning up the battlefield. Even so, when many of the recruits arrived at the battlefield and saw the blood flowing like a river and broken limbs all over the ground, many of them couldn't help but vomit. This was normal, and no one would laugh at them. Elite veteran soldiers weren't originally so iron-blooded. They were all tempered through battle after battle. In the middle of the Mongolian army, Gray saw this scene with his own eyes, and a flash of astonishment appeared in his eyes. It wasn't that he hadn't seen firearms before. His old opponent, the White Russian Army, had them. Their Khan also had a small number of firearms, but in terms of power, they were far inferior to the firearms in the hands of the 5-star army. Not only could the 5-star army's firearms fire faster, their accuracy was also higher than the firearms he had seen before. Most importantly, they could fire continuously. Heavens! Where did they get these firearms from? They were so powerful. The cavalrymen's charge was just seeking death. How could they win? At this moment, panic appeared in his heart, and he was no longer as confident and conceited as he was before. After being frightened by the powerful firepower and might of the 95 style, Gray didn't immediately order his men to rescue the survivors. When the battlefield was almost completely cleaned up, he suddenly thought of something. However, at this moment, the 1,000 cavalrymen who had luckily escaped the clutches of the musketeers were being surrounded by the cavalrymen of the new Second Army. Friction, friction, and continuous friction. Their courage was broken. After losing their courage, the 1,000 Mongolian cavalrymen were like birds startled by the twang of a bow. They were completely surrounded, and if they were killed, if they were captured, attack the left side, attack the left side. The firepower of the 5-star army on the right side had frightened him. Gray had no choice but to give up on the idea of attacking from that side. He wanted to see the situation on the left side. If he could, he would rush out from there. Now, he was not thinking about how to take Kazan, but how to leave this place and inform the Khan of the fact that the 5-star army had powerful guns. Another 5,000 Mongolian cavaliers came from the left, and the third commander of 2nd Cold Vanguard Division, Chu Luo, laughed loudly. Good timing, good timing. It's time for our 3rd Regiment to show our might. Come on, listen to my orders and prepare to fire. Lung Feng soldiers from the 3rd Regiment and 3 battalions were eager to give it a try. Even the new 2nd Army and White Russian cavalry beside them were no longer panicking. They focused their attention on Lung Feng, who was holding on to his musket. They wanted to see another miracle. Baba Baba, Baba Baba, the gunshots rang out just as everyone expected. Before the 5,000 Mongolian cavaliers could reach the 5-star army, most of them were killed. Then, countless cavaliers rushed out to kill the survivors and clean up the battlefield. Charge and tangle with the enemy cavaliers. They won't be our match. With the lesson just now, Gray did not hesitate this time. Instead, he immediately sent out 2,000 cavaliers. He wanted to think of a way for them to tangle with the 5-star army. This way, the enemy would not use their guns out of fear, and the advantage would fall into his hands. With a single order, the 2,000 elite Mongolian cavaliers charged forward. Although they were intimidated by the powerful guns of the 5-star army, they had to charge forward since their general had given the order. Great, more people are coming to die. Everyone, 2 bullets. Once we're done, we'll call it a day. The 3rd commander, Chu Luo, laughed loudly to release his joyful mood. Then he took the lead and fired a bullet. The bullets seemed to have eyes as they charged towards the incoming Mongolian cavalry. There were only 2,000 of them, and they were only left with less than 300 in a short period of time. By the time they arrived in front of the new 2nd Army, they were no longer able to do anything. How did this happen? How did this happen? Gray's expression became increasingly ugly when he saw the reinforcements he had sent out being buried so quickly. It was as if he had seen a ghost. While his expression changed, he turned around to look behind him. In just 2 short attacks, they had lost 12,000 cavaliers. Not a single one of the cavaliers who had charged out had returned alive. This was the first time he had seen such a loss after becoming a general. In the past, when he had fought with the White Russian army, he had suffered some losses. However, if he wanted to retreat, he could do so. How was it like facing the 5-star army, where none of the cavaliers he had sent out had returned? It wasn't just Gray. The 3,000-plus cavaliers under him, as well as the 30,000 White Russian slaves, all revealed terrified expressions. This time they had thought that this was an easy mission to complete, and that it was time for them to show off the might of the Mongolian cavaliers. However, who would have thought that this was simply hell? In front of the 5-star army, they were just like loathsome mosquitoes that could be stepped on and slaughtered at will. No one had any ideas. They could only look at Gray, hoping that he would have a way to turn the situation around. However, Gray had long since run out of ideas. He had only taken a glance behind him, and did not give the order to break out of the encirclement. From his point of view, he still had a chance. There was no need for him to make a decision to fight to the death. He could continue waiting. Once there was no news of him from the Khan for a long time, he would definitely send reinforcements. When that happened, there would be an opportunity for him to coordinate with the Mongolian cavaliers. With hope in his heart, Gray decided to pull back his troops and focus on defense. His army could no longer take a beating. If not, their morale would be completely destroyed. While the 5-star army on the left, rear, and right were waiting for their opponents to choose to attack, the Mongolian cavaliers had actually stopped in their tracks. Furthermore, they quickly took out the barricades that they had put away in the morning and assumed a stance that they were going to defend to the death. This infuriated the 3 armies surrounding them. What are they doing? They've only charged out twice, and they're already afraid. What a bunch of cowards. They're cowards. How can such people claim to be the strongest Mongolian cavaliers in the world? What a joke. Angry shouts followed, and there were even people shouting in dissatisfaction. When the shouts reached the Mongolian camp, the faces of Gray and many of the young generals turned pale. They were ashamed and embarrassed. Not long ago, they had accused the Hans of being two-legged sheep, saying that they only knew how to hide within the city walls and not dare to come out to fight. However, today everything had changed. They had become cowards, cowards who did not dare to come out to fight. However, they were still inferior to the Hans. At the very least, the Hans had sturdy city walls, while they only had a simple camp made up of wooden fences. Could such a camp block the enemy's charge? Order the archers to prepare for a counterattack. Also, place the 30,000 White Russian slaves at the outermost perimeter. Gray said worriedly. He wanted to use the White Russians as human shields to protect their safety. Regardless of whether the White Russians were willing or not, under the threat of the 30,000 Mongolian cavaliers, they could only do as they were told. This scene was seen by the surrounding White Russian soldiers, causing many of them to reveal expressions of anger. Although these people were not their friends, from a certain point of view, they had a common ancestor. In fact, if they were a few generations older, they might even be of the same race. Seeing their fellow countrymen being humiliated and threatened, some of the hot-blooded people actually took the initiative to ask for battle. They wanted to charge up and kill the Mongolian cavaliers to save the people with the same skin as them. On the city wall, the generals were still in a state of excitement from their great victory, especially Nikolai and Ahuli. This was the first time they had seen the 5-star army show off their might with their guns. Naturally, they were excited and emotional. They were proud to have joined such a powerful force. At this moment, the voices of the soldiers asking for battle reached the ears of the 2 division commanders. After looking at each other, they reported to Yang Qindong. The final decision was still in the hands of Bugnam of Gojoseon. Let's talk about it later. Yang Qindong did not agree. From his point of view, now was not the time to attack. Although the White Russian soldiers were of a different race, they had surrendered to him and joined the 5-star army. He had to consider their safety. At the very least, he could not let them die for nothing. Before they could form a fighting force, Yang Qindong would not let the White Russians take the risk. This was out of kindness, and Nikolai and Ahuli were naturally clear about it. They did not fight for it. Instead, they were touched by Yang Qindong's sympathy. Furthermore, Yang Qindong's gaze was deep and calm. With the might of his guns, the 80,000 Mongolian soldiers were just monkeys in the palm of the Buddha. He could play with them however he wanted. If not for the fact that the other party was strong and could not develop without sufficient manpower, he would have already given the order to annihilate them. Yang Qindong did not hold much hatred towards the Mongol army. Due to geographical reasons, the Mongol army did not have much conflict with the Han people. Even after they were defeated in history, they did not cause much harm. Therefore, if he could capture more of them, he was willing to do so, even if it took more effort. Gray didn't know about this. What he needed to do now was wait for reinforcements to appear. This time, as he was rushing for time, he had only brought 3 days' worth of rations. From his point of view, even if they could not attack Kazan City, reinforcements would arrive. If they did not have enough rations, they could just wait patiently. In fact, he was still waiting for reinforcements to appear. At that time, he might be able to coordinate with them. After seeing the might of the 5-star Army's guns, he did not dare to think about attacking the city. However, there was a high possibility of retreating. Chapter 14:26. The reinforcements in Gray's mind were indeed on their way here. However, not long after they left Samara City, they were surrounded by the commander of the new Second Army, Shibi, who had suddenly appeared along a tributary of the Volga River. The 1st Regiment commander of the 2nd Cold Front Division, Chai-ji, was also with him. The sound of a gun was exchanged for 10,000 taels of gold. In just an hour, 5,000 reinforcements and 100 carriages of rations were exchanged for the 5th Star Army's contribution. Reporting to the commander, "We have killed more than 870 enemies and captured the rest. Not a single one escaped. Please report." The commander of the guards, Su Liang, reported the results of the battle in a loud voice. "Quickly clean up the battlefield. Do not leave behind any traces of battle." Shibi returned the salute and gave the order. Then he smiled at Chai-ji and asked, "Commander Chai, why do you look so down?" "Yes, these opponents are too weak. It's not fun to fight them." Chai-ji sighed and pretended to be a fool. At this moment, he looked as if he had taken advantage of the situation and was pretending to be innocent. After listening to him, Shibi did not expose him. Instead, he pretended to be deep in thought and said, "Since that's the case, the next time the Mongolian army sends reinforcements, let us, the new Second Army, deal with them. If there are people who try to escape, you can attack them." Chai-ji jumped up like a rabbit whose tail had been stepped on. "How is that possible?" The 6th young master said that the Cold Front Division should be the main force in the battle. Only then can we eliminate the enemy faster and more thoroughly. How can we, his subordinates, change the order? "Oh, then we will have to trouble Commander Chai." Shibi smiled bitterly. Yang Qindong's order was like this, but it was just an excuse. In short, the Cold Front Division should be the first to fight. If there were any problems, the new Second Army could only get the leftovers. But in the face of the tyrannical advantage of firearms, how could there be any problems? Just as Shibi and Chai-ji were lamenting that the enemy was too weak and that the battle was not challenging at all. Further south, the Reconnaissance Division commander Su Yunsheng was leading a small group of cavalry on a patrol. Su Yunsheng entered the Golden Horde with the 2nd Division of the Cold Front and the transport team. After coming here, Yang Qindong gave him a new order, which was to go to the front lines and completely seal off the battle below Kazan. In other words, not a single Mongolian scout was allowed to enter the battlefield. This would create a sense of mystery and prevent the Golden Horde from acting rashly because they did not know what was going on. In Yang Qindong's eyes, the final battle would take place next year. What he needed to do this year was to stabilize the rear. As the old saying goes, to resist foreign aggression, one must first stabilize the internal situation. Naturally, he would not be at ease if such a difficult mission was given to others. Even the most elite Lung Feng could not guarantee that no one would escape and that there would be no problems. However, it was a completely different story when it was handed over to Su Yunsheng, the Recon Division commander. When it came to scouting, there were very few people in Yang Xie's 5-star army that were his match. Thus, he could rest assured that the mission would be given to him. After Su Yunsheng received the order, he split the 3,000 cavalry scouts into 30 squadrons and 300 squads to spread out. His request was to control the entire defensive line from Asala to Kazan. He wanted to ensure that every forest, every river, and every mountain was under surveillance. The scouts were mobilized. The mission they received was difficult and not easy to carry out. After all, There were too few of them, and the area was too big. However, after being divided into 300 squads, they still managed to do it. From the start of the mission until now, they had secretly killed more than 100 Mongolian scouts and completely controlled the area. Not everyone could be a good scout. Normally, it would be difficult to find one qualified scout out of 100 Mongolian cavalrymen. This time, more than 100 of them were wiped out. No matter how strong the Golden Horde was, it was enough to cause them serious damage and make them suffer a lot. Division Commander, the soldiers have achieved a lot in the past 3 days. I think the Inner Mongolian army will not be able to send any more scouts to gather information in the near future. Yen Da, who had been promoted from battalion commander to regiment commander, said with a smile. His face was filled with excitement and pride. Don't be careless. Before we receive the order to retreat, let the soldiers keep their eyes open. This is a military order from the 6th young master. We can't be careless, and we can't ruin the reputation of our scouts. Su Yunsheng replied with a serious expression. It was all thanks to Yang Qindong that he could have today. This time, it was the order of the 6th young master himself. He would never have the slightest bit of carelessness. Yen Da's expression turned serious. Division Commander, please do not worry. Your subordinate will pass on this order now. The scouts were unable to find out the exact situation of the battle. Another batch of reinforcements arrived and was dealt with. In the short span of 3 days, 2 batches of 10,000 reinforcements were surrounded and captured alive. Just the number of captives was close to 8,000. At this point, Gray's troops were completely isolated. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. There was no change in the situation. The food in the army had basically been depleted. At this moment, it was not an exaggeration to say that he had run out of food and ammunition. In just 3 days, the morale of the army had fallen to the extreme. Many soldiers were unwilling to get up in order to reduce the consumption of energy. They did not look like soldiers and did not have the morale to fight. This made him very angry. He was also very helpless. Should he charge? The 2 failures had already told him that the Han people were very powerful. Charging was just suicide. Should he retreat? Their path of retreat was blocked. Without the cooperation of reinforcements, how could they charge out? Should he surrender? As a general of the Golden Horde, his dignity did not allow him to do so. At this moment, he did not know what to do. The most terrible thing in a war was to wander around without a purpose. That would only waste time and create opportunities for the enemy to destroy you. After all, Gray was one of the top generals in the Golden Horde. He would never have thought of making such a low-level mistake, but he was making it now. Without a goal in mind, waiting to die was the only thing Gray could do at this moment, as well as the only thing he could do. He looked around and found that the Han people's camp had not changed at all. In the past 3 days, there had not been a single opening. If he continued to wait, there might not be any good opportunities. Since he could not wait for the enemy to make a mistake, he could only take the initiative to attack. Without anyone to cooperate with, he could only rely on himself to kill his way out. No matter what, he was the 2nd-ranked general of the Golden Horde. He had a resolute heart. Gray's target was the southeast side behind him. He had already observed that there were only about 20,000 Han people there. He still had 30,000 elite cavalry and 30,000 White Russian slaves. When the time came, he would leave 20,000 White Russian slaves to guard his back while the 10,000 White Russian slaves charged forward. Once they got close to the Han army, he would lead the cavalry to break through the encirclement. He did not ask for victory in this battle, nor did he ask for the number of enemies he could kill. As long as he could charge out, it would be a victory. With such low requirements, there should be a chance for him to do it. Men, distribute the rations and prepare for battle. Gray was very smart. He used the Han people's military tactics to fight, to survive. Without enough rations, everyone could not continue to wait. The only path left was to fight with their lives on the line. Kazan City. Every move of the Mongolian army would be reported to Yang Qindong at any time. When he heard that the other side had started to distribute the rations, Yang Qindong, who was writing a development plan with his head lowered, slowly raised his head. His eyes flashed with a light of wisdom. Are they preparing for a counterattack? It's been 3 days. They should be unable to hold themselves back. Gray did not know that his every move had been seen clearly by Yang Qindong. Even if he knew, he would not care. He had summoned several captains and kiliarchs of the army and was cheering them on. Everyone, the might of the 5-star Army's firearms is extremely strong. They are many times stronger than the White Russian Army. This kind of enemy is not something we can deal with. Therefore, I have decided to break out of the encirclement. As long as we can escape, it will be a great victory. We can then report the situation of the 5-star Army to the Khan. In the future, we should not be impulsive and take the initiative to find trouble. Defending our own city is the best choice. After all, it has been proven that the other side only has firearms and no cannons. This is the only thing we can rejoice about. Bang, bang! It seemed to be a slap in the face. Just as Gray finished speaking, the roar of the cannons rang out, causing the faces of the generals present to turn ugly. There was no need to talk about Gray. His eyes were so red that they could be compared to a monkey's, but at this moment he finally understood that it was not that the other side did not have cannons. It was just that the time was not right. Just by listening to the sound of the cannons, he knew that the other side's cannons were as powerful as their firearms. The 100 mm mortar started to wreak havoc in the Mongol cavalry camp. Under the command of the 2nd Division Artillery Battalion Commander Linlin, a total of 20 cannons landed one after another beside the camp. When the first cannonball landed, it caused a huge wave that was enough to blow over the camp and cause the neighs of war horses to ring out continuously. Although it was only a total of 60 cannonballs, it was enough to cause a huge wave, causing Gray, who was preparing to break out of the encirclement, to be completely defeated. What's going on? Where did the cannons come from? Where did the cannons come from? Gray walked out of the large tent and grabbed a Mongol soldier who was running around in panic. It's the cannons from Kazan City. That soldier originally wanted to break free from his restraints. He did not want to die and only wanted to find a safe place to hide. However, when he saw that the person who stopped him was General Gray, he had no choice but to stand on the spot and answer. The cannons from the city? That's impossible. After hearing this answer, Gray shook his head continuously. That was a distance of 8 li. He did not believe that any cannons could reach that far. Furthermore, the cannons were not solid shells, but explosive shells. All of this had already exceeded his understanding. Chapter 14:27. Regardless of whether he wanted to admit it or not, the moment the cannons stopped firing, all sorts of information had been sent over by the army, confirming that the Han soldiers had fired from the city walls. Upon hearing this, Gray's face turned deathly pale. How could he possibly contend against an opponent that possessed a firearm that could fire continuously and a cannon that could fire from such a long distance? Gray did not believe that the reason why the cannon did not land in the center of the camp was because the Han soldiers were not accurate enough. This was clearly an attempt by the other party to intimidate him. There was only one reason for doing so, and that was to subdue him. Surrender? That's impossible. Although Gray had already lost most of his fighting spirit, as a general of the Golden Horde, his pride would not allow him to easily lower his head. After the cannons fired, the morale of the Mongolian soldiers who had just eaten their last rations fell to the bottom once again. Facing such a powerful opponent that they could not even see, how were they supposed to fight this battle? Just as the morale of the entire army was at its lowest and the soldiers were in a state of panic, the call for surrender finally rang out. Loud voices rang out as the soldiers of the 5-star army surrounded the 50,000-strong Mongolian camp, shouting the slogan, "Surrender and live. Those who resist will die." These words were shouted out in Mandarin, Mongolian, and Russian. ensuring that the surrounded enemies could hear them clearly. As the calls for surrender rang out, the entire camp seemed to have exploded with different reactions from the soldiers. After witnessing the powerful firepower of the 5-star army, many of the soldiers had already felt powerless. Furthermore, they had already run out of rations, so even if they wanted to persist, they did not have the confidence to do so. Thus, some of the soldiers had a bold idea of surrendering to the Han soldiers. As the saying goes, a bad life is better than a good death, right? Furthermore, the Han soldiers possessed such powerful firearms. Surrendering to them was not a shameful matter. Gray noticed the changes in the expressions of the soldiers, causing him to feel extremely anxious. He knew that the situation was developing towards the worst possible outcome. If he was unable to think of a solution in a short period of time, the 50,000-strong army might really have to surrender to the Han soldiers. Reinforcements. Where exactly are the reinforcements? Gray placed his last hope on the reinforcements. He didn't believe that the Khan would give up on him. Then why hadn't the army transporting the rations arrived yet? He arranged for his personal guards to keep an eye on the rear. As long as he saw a trace of chaos in the 5-star army, he would have the confidence to charge out and meet up with the reinforcements. As the sky gradually darkened, Gray, who was still persevering, did not give the order to surrender. The soldiers below could only endure, hugging their weapons and curling up together. Since they had already confirmed that there was no dinner, they could only move less to reduce their energy consumption. However, he neglected one thing, and that was the hearts of the soldiers. During the day, due to the strict supervision, as well as the fact that Gray had sent out his personal guards to patrol the area, no one dared to escape in front of them. However, it was different when it was dark. The limited vision caused many gaps to appear in the barracks. This gave some soldiers who were ready to surrender a chance to survive. The sky had just turned dark, and a team of 100 people had already surrendered. When the news reached Gray's ears, he remained silent. After a while, he replied, "Got it." With the situation as such, it wasn't something that could be changed by human strength. In the end, Gray was still soft-hearted. He didn't want to see all of his soldiers die here like him. Why not be merciful before they die and give them a chance to live? The general's disregard for everything sped up the process of the Mongol army surrendering. At the start, it was only 100 men surrendering. Under the threat of the powerful guns and cannons, it was 1,000 men surrendering one by one. No one even bothered to look after the White Russian slaves. In the end, during the chaos, the Mongol soldiers and White Russian slaves surrendered to the 5-star army. Division Commander Xiao Feng's mission was to guard the rear of the Mongol cavalry. According to the plan, this was likely to be the place where the battle was the most intense. After all, once they discovered that the road ahead was blocked, the Mongol army that wanted to escape would definitely charge towards this place. The plan couldn't keep up with the changes. The Mongol army, which still had over 50,000 soldiers, had actually surrendered just like that. This caused all of Xiao Feng's preparations to be useless. He could only lead his soldiers to capture captives. For the entire night, no one was able to find a chance to rest. When the sun rose, the entire Mongol camp was already empty. When General Gray walked out of his tent, he saw less than 2,000 soldiers. It wasn't that these people didn't want to escape, but that they had killed too many people. They were afraid that even if they surrendered, they wouldn't be able to survive. Okay, looking at the remaining 2,000 cavalrymen, Gray started to relax. He could finally go all out without any misgivings. Everyone, centaurs. Outside the camp, Division Commander Xiao Feng didn't reveal any signs of exhaustion after a night of hard work. On the contrary, he was extremely excited. After his continuous requests, Yang Qindong finally handed over the task of dealing with the remaining 2,000 Mongol cavalry soldiers to him. Although their numbers were slightly less, they could still put up a good fight. Early in the morning, Xiao Feng had gathered a few thousand soldiers and surrounded the Mongol camp. Now, All they had to do was wait for the enemy to charge out so that they could deal with the problem in one go. After the formation was set up, the Mongol cavalry soldiers walked out of the camp as expected. Although there were less than 2,000 cavalry soldiers left, they were all prepared to die, causing them to appear exceptionally imposing. Immediately put down your weapons and surrender. If not, don't blame us for being impolite. Division Commander Xiao Feng finally had the chance to shout out. His shout wasn't soft, but there was another voice that resounded in Xiao Feng's heart. You must not surrender. You must not surrender. If not, with such a large formation, there won't be a battle to fight. Xiao Feng was worried that these 2,000 soldiers would still choose to surrender. However, his worries were clearly unnecessary. Since these people didn't choose to surrender last night, why would they do so now? Facing the ice-cold muzzles of the Mongol cavalry soldiers, all of them pulled out their cavalry swords. Under General Gray's furious roar, they started a suicidal charge. Iron hooves stomped on the ground, causing dust to rise. One after another, the Mongol cavalry soldiers shouted loudly, waving their cavalry swords as they charged forward. What welcomed them was Division Commander Xiao Feng's command, following which gunshots rang out. Bullets whizzed through the air, piercing through the bodies of the charging cavalry soldiers. Blood splattered everywhere. One after another, the Mongol cavalry soldiers fell on the path of the charge. The Mongol cavalry soldiers were already prepared. Almost every one of them was shot in the chest. Their cavalry swords fell from their hands, and their corpses fell from their horses like dumplings. Gray took the lead, carrying out the duties of a general as he charged at the very front. Although he didn't turn his head, his senses told him that soldiers were falling beside him. Very quickly, there were no other noises around him. When he was 50 meters away from the Mongol cavalry soldiers, his surroundings became extremely quiet. He finally couldn't help but turn his head around. All he saw was a ground full of corpses, and the war horses that no one was commanding were whining on the spot. Reality told him that everyone had died in battle except for himself. This was enough to prove that the Mongol cavalry soldiers' marksmanship had reached a level where they could hit wherever they wanted. If not, why was he the only one left alive? Why? When he saw that he was the only one left alive, Gray was on the verge of breaking down. This was the outcome he didn't want to see the most. He wanted to die like a brave warrior, but these Han people didn't give him such a chance. As Gray shouted, 2 sturdy horses appeared in front of him. One of them was holding a sharp divine saber, while the other was holding a rather heavy mace. They blocked Gray's path of advance, one on the left and one on the right. The people who had come were Beta Persei and Ahuli. The former had only been allowed to enter the battlefield after continuously begging Yang Qindong. As for Ahuli, Yang Qindong cherished talent. He had already found out from the captives that everyone had surrendered because Gray had tacitly agreed to it. This was enough to prove that Gray was still kind. He liked such people very much and was willing to recruit them. Ahuli's mission was to persuade Gray to work for him. When Gray saw the 2 warriors, he couldn't help but stop his horse. He wanted to see what the other party wanted to say to him. You must be General Gray. My young master already knows what you've done. He admires you very much. Now I'll give you a chance. Dismount and surrender. Not only will you not die, but if you perform well enough, you can also lead soldiers and become a general again. Of course, this so-called performance means that you have to defeat me. Do you dare? Beta Persei stretched out his left hand and gently stroked the cavalry sword in his hand. An eager expression appeared on his face. He didn't ask if he could, but if he dared. This was originally a verbal trap. However, Gray was clearly infuriated by young heir's words. He had lost, but he had lost to the powerful guns and cannons, not because he was afraid of the 2-legged Han people. Seeing that Beta Persei had challenged him on behalf of the Han people, Gray, who had long been suppressing his anger and wanted to prove himself, immediately shouted back, "Who's afraid is a coward! Just don't let others help you with guns." Beta Persei was afraid that Gray wouldn't agree. As long as he was given a chance to fight, why would he need the help of others? Did he really think that he was playing around with Yang Qindong these days? With a Grandmaster by his side, his improvement was obvious. Although he could often fight with the Black Cavalry, it was not a life-and-death battle, so he couldn't completely let go. Now that the opportunity had appeared, he laughed and said, "Okay, it'll be a one-on-one fight between the two of us. Ahuli, you don't have to help." Chapter 1428. Ahuli, who had been called out, was already prepared to step in once Beta Persei was no match for him. This person was Bugnam of Gojoseon's personal guard and was the most trusted person. Nothing must happen to him, especially in front of Ahuli. But he never thought that Beta Persei would call out his name. This left him at a loss for what to do for a moment. Before Ahuli could think of what to do next, Beta Persei had already urged his horse to rush out. Gray, who was opposite him, also shouted and rushed over on his horse. If it was a battle on land, there was almost no suspense. Beta Persei could always be by Yang Qindong's side, so how could his skills be bad? But this was a battle on horseback. Not only did it depend on who was braver and stronger, it also depended on who was more skilled in horsemanship. Why had the Central Plains, who seemed to be quite strong, always been unable to defeat the people of the grasslands? Was it because they were not brave? Of course, the answer was not like that. There was a certain gap between the two sides, and the difference was in the control of horsemanship. I didn't just call them a people on horseback. Many times, cavalry and war horses had long been integrated into one. Some war horses with intelligence could even analyze what to do next based on their master's mood. In contrast, the Han people rode horses to prepare for war. They had a short time of training, and their tacit understanding with their war horses was far inferior to that of the Mongolian knights. This made the other party's cavalry unstoppable. The Han people would always be defeated again and again. In the end, they could only passively defend. Ahuli, who knew this well, couldn't help but worry about Beta Persei. At the same time, he stared nervously at the battlefield. Even if he had to disobey the military order, he had to rush forward to save Beta Persei when he was in trouble. Gray, who was in the middle of the battlefield, had no time to think about other things. Beta Persei had already rushed towards him on his war horse with a saber in hand. Just from the other party's riding posture and the way he held his saber, he had a feeling that this Han person was much stronger than he had imagined. There was a smile on his face, and if one looked closely, it was caused by excitement. Ever since he was a child, Beta Persei had been a great admirer of heroes, especially since Yang Qindong created the industry of storytelling. Beta Persei would often visit Yang Qindong when he was off work, and he had heard of countless heroic deeds. For example, Guan Yu beheading Hua Xiong with warm wine, the three heroes' battle against Lu Bu, and so on. More than once, he had thought that one day he would be like the hero in those books, and then become famous throughout the world. The wife of Ba Daojiang, the vice captain of the Black Cavalry 1st Platoon, was the head of the publicity department. As long as what he said was the truth, she would be able to create a drama based on him. If that was the case, wouldn't he be famous all over the world? Even if it was for the sake of becoming famous and becoming a hero, Beta Persei had to perform well. He brought out 120% of his spirit. When he faced Gray, there was no fear or dread in his eyes, only excitement and agitation. "Watch my blade." Borrowing the horse's momentum, he quickly rushed in front of Gray. Then he slashed down with his blade. He used 100% of his strength in this slash. Gray didn't know about this. In his opinion, the outcome of the battle between the two of them couldn't be determined in a short period of time. This meant that he had to save his strength. At the very least, he couldn't use it all at once. Otherwise, how could he continue to play? Instinctively, he only used 60% of his strength to block this slash. He was even prepared to counterattack after blocking the attack. However, when the two sabers collided with the scimitar, he knew that he was wrong, very wrong. Oh my God! Instinctively, Gray, who had let out a sigh, couldn't help but feel his right arm being pressed down. At this moment, he felt that his right arm had been injured with just one blow. What was worse was that the saber was still transmitting a huge amount of force, forcing his saber to move back bit by bit. His face was red. At this moment, Gray wanted to continue increasing his strength to turn the situation around. However, in a situation where he was already suppressed, it was very difficult to turn the situation around. Furthermore, his opponent didn't seem to be giving him the time to do so. Beta Persei was a hothead. In his eyes, there were no rules of a one-on-one fight. In his opinion, a move that could knock down his opponent was a good move. Just like what the young master always said, no matter if it was a black cat or a white cat, it was a good cat if it could catch a mouse. As for gaining the upper hand in just one round, this was somewhat out of Beta Persei's expectations. He had always heard people say how good the Mongolian cavalry was on horseback, how exquisite the Mongolian general's equestrian skills were, and how outstanding his strength was. He was even prepared for a bitter battle. However, he didn't expect to completely suppress his opponent in just one round. He felt that the strength of his opponent's arm was much weaker than he had imagined. Thus, he had to take advantage of the situation and say, "Oh, this strength isn't that great either?" It would have been better if he didn't say anything. After hearing this, Gray's expression turned ugly. His face, which was originally red from holding his breath, became even redder. It was as if he was about to turn completely red. At this moment, he wanted to angrily scold his opponent for not following the rules. Why did he have to use his full strength right from the start? However, he didn't have the chance to speak at all. The two scimitars, one up and one down, were still rapidly approaching Gray's chest. No matter how hard Gray tried, it was already impossible for him to turn the situation around. In just a short while, he felt his entire right arm go numb and sore. If not for his willpower supporting him, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to hold on anymore. Beta Persei, who had the upper hand, was continuously exerting his strength. Seeing that the situation was set, he even saw that a crack had appeared on his opponent's scimitar because of the continuous attacks. He was afraid that if he continued to persevere, he wouldn't have to do anything. The strength of his scimitar would be enough to guarantee victory. Thus, he slightly restrained his strength. Then his body slanted, and he took the opportunity to kick forward. Beta Persei was very clear in his heart that the young master wanted a living Mongolian general, not a dead one. Otherwise, why would he need to put in so much effort? A single bullet would be enough to end the battle. The kick came without any warning, causing a hint of joy to appear on Gray's face. He thought that his opponent was powerless and was about to withdraw his scimitar. Just as he was about to counterattack, a large foot appeared in front of his eyes. Then, the foot grew bigger and bigger until he felt a sudden pain in his chest. Beta Persei's strength was so great that this kick made Gray feel as if he couldn't breathe. Then he fell from his horse, and a sharp saber was placed on his neck. Originally, they thought that it would be a fierce battle. However, who would have thought that it would end so anticlimactically? Many people didn't have the time to watch it before it ended. Gray had become a captive under the saber. There was no need for Beta Persei to say anything. The other 5-star army soldiers had already run over and tied up Gray, who had fallen to the ground. With him tied up, it also meant that the Mongolian army had suffered a great defeat. A total of 80,000 people came. After this battle, the number of captives reached 60,000. Haha, this Khagan of the Golden Horde is a little like a transport captain. After Yang Qindong finished speaking, he didn't care if anyone else understood him. He turned around and went down the city gate tower. Just yesterday, he received a telegram from the world's 1st Cavalry Army and the Cold Front's 3rd Cavalry Army. It recorded that they had defeated Turgenev of the Russian clan. Turgenev had underestimated his opponent and rashly attacked. The Cold Front's 2nd Cavalry Division had sent reinforcements and made him dizzy. Then the world's 1st Cavalry Army took the opportunity to attack and ended the battle. Yang Qindong had already expected this result. Turgenev wasn't a direct descendant of the Russian duchy. Furthermore, he had underestimated his opponent and sent out his troops against the Cold Front and the world's 1st Cavalry Army. It would be strange if he didn't lose. The only regret was that Turgenev had escaped. No one would have thought that when the world's 1st Cavalry Army launched their attack, Turgenev would be one of the first to escape. This caused the morale of the Mongolian army to plummet. At the same time, it also allowed the general to escape the net. Perhaps the Cold Front's 2nd Cavalry Division and the world's 1st Cavalry Army had fought too fiercely. In the end, only 70,000 of the 100,000 enemies had escaped. Only 30,000 had been killed or captured. Since the battle had been decided, the next thing he had to think about was how to revive the country. He had to turn this place into an important Yangtze military base in the shortest time possible. 7 days had passed, and there was still no news about the attack on Kazan City. Mahamar's intuition told him that things weren't going well. What's going on? Send someone to investigate. This Khan doesn't believe that 80,000 people can fly to the sky. If they're alive, I want to see them. If they're dead, I want to see their corpses. With a face full of dissatisfaction, Mahamar called over his subordinate, General Bodo, who was in charge of scouting and intelligence. Yes, your humble servant will immediately investigate. Bodo was sweating profusely. A total of 50,000 elite cavalrymen and 30,000 White Russian slaves had disappeared not long after leaving Samara City. Not only that, but the 3 transport brigades that he had sent out, a total of 15,000 people, had also disappeared. There are also more than 200 elite scouts that he had sent out. They had all disappeared. That was more than 200 elite scouts, and he had invested a lot of effort into them. Now that there was no news, he didn't even dare to tell the Khan. He was afraid that he would have to bear the responsibility in the end. Bodo quickly turned around and left. What he didn't know was that the nightmare would continue. With Commander Su Yunsheng leading 3,000 elite cavalry scouts, no matter how many scouts he sent out, they would all be like meat buns thrown to a dog, never to return. They won in one battle, and it was an easy victory. All the soldiers who had experienced this scene, especially the Mongol and White Russian soldiers who had just joined, were full of admiration for the 5-star army. They didn't need anyone to tell them what to do next, and they all focused on training. Chapter 14:29. Interest was the best teacher. When there was motivation, the enthusiasm of the soldiers increased. As the instructors, the skeleton warriors of the 5-star army felt much more relaxed. When the matter was reported to Yang Qindong, he didn't care about it anymore. He had already focused on the road construction. This place was too far away from the 5-star army's base camp. Even if it was relatively close to the 3 eastern provinces and Shicheng, it would still take 1 or 2 months to travel. Such a long transportation line made Yang Qindong worried. He couldn't watch a large number of supplies being consumed on the road. Although Yangtze was developing fast and had enough wealth to persist, if he didn't think of a solution, it would eventually become a problem. It might become a fatal problem at any time. In order to save time on the road, Yang Qindong thought of the steam train. It had been more than 2 months since the first steam engine was built in Resin City. Many things were difficult in the beginning and difficult in the first step. As long as the first step was taken well, many things would become much easier in the future. According to the telegram, the number of steam engines in Resin City had already exceeded 5,000, and the number would increase exponentially every month. The fields involved included mining, water pumping, agriculture, textiles, construction of field cannons, and so on. following the continuous research and development, it would also involve the power drive, such as the use of warships and the real construction of trains. Over the years, the research department of Crimson City had been working hard on the exploration. They had even created electric batteries, and they had also built electric scooters according to the ideas provided by Yang Qindong. Although they could only build two-wheeled motorcycles and three-wheeled motorcycles due to the limitations of their efficiency, they could still build two. As long as they had the right ideas, it wouldn't be difficult to build electric scooters in the near future. Even so, with the steam engine, would the steam train be far away? Once there was a train, it would greatly increase the speed of the Five-Star Army's march and Yangtze's commercial and industrial development. At that time, with the fastest speed, they could achieve twice the result with half the effort. Yang Qindong was confident that this day wouldn't be too far away. What he needed to do now was to make all the necessary preparations. For example, the provinces of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia had already begun to lay down railway tracks in preparation for the appearance and operation of trains. Even the origin city had begun to study this matter. It was said that they were preparing for the project. As their leader, Yang Qindong naturally couldn't be left behind. First, he had to build the road and lay a good foundation. This was what he was prepared to do this winter. Once there was a good foundation, the rails could be laid as soon as they were in place. Would the steam train be far away? At that time, the local specialties here could be easily transported out in the shortest time. The thought of the profits made Yang Qindong smile in his sleep. After setting the plan, Yang Qindong gave the order and began to get busy. The White Russians and Mongolian captives were the main force, while the rest were invited over with money and food. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the situation changed every day. In just the first day, these people cleared the mountains, built bridges, and built a solid foundation of 3 kilometers. Don't underestimate these 3 kilometers. Many of them were doing this for the first time and didn't know where to start. As they became more familiar with it, they could even reach 30 kilometers a day, or even longer. At this time, Yang Qindong seemed to be able to see the scene of a steam train burning coal and water roaming the land. Compared to the bustling construction scene in the east of Yangqin, the world's first cavalry army was recuperating and training in Oxino City. Not everyone was like Yang Qindong. They could create many things that were much more advanced than the modern era. Take Tianhu, for example. All he could do was train his elite troops and win battles. After meeting up with Wu Sheng's Third Army, they unexpectedly went north and occupied Oxino City in order to find a place to rest and recuperate. Wu Sheng's Third Army was basically destroyed this time, and their fighting strength was less than 20%. They would need at least half a year to recover to a certain extent. In comparison, the world's #1 cavalry army did not need to do so. They had won the battle with the White Russians almost immediately and had not suffered any losses. While Commander Tianhu was resting, he began to lead the cavalry of the First Army to the nearby areas to gather grass and grains. What Tianhu did not expect was that although there were many White Russian villages in the surrounding area, they were simply too poor. It was to the point that many people had problems even eating. When he led the army to places, they did not encounter any resistance. Afterwards, countless people brought their families and surrendered. In order to survive, they even took out the only food they had. In Tianhu's eyes, the amount of food they had made him not know whether to laugh or cry. Originally, he wanted to make a profit, but he did not expect that the nearby White Russians were even poorer than him. In desperation, Tianhu could only give up on robbing the people. However, what he did not expect was that he would gain the title of a benevolent and righteous army. It turned out that the bloodlines of these White Russians were not the purest. Their bloodlines were not only White Russians, but also Mongols and other white races. Because of this, the blind Duke and the other White Russians who believed themselves to be pure did not approve of them and even began to abandon them. Only when they lacked food would they occasionally think of them and rob them. They were originally poor, and after being robbed again and again, these impure White Russians only became poorer. There were even cases of them trading children for food. But even so, they were still struggling to survive. This was also one of the reasons why when Tian, who appeared with the army, they instinctively offered up their food in order to survive. After getting used to being robbed, when they suddenly saw that the Han army did not want anything, the people were moved and became more willing. Many of them actually followed Tian, whose army, back to Oxino City. This was all because they were filled with envy when they saw that the #1 cavalry army in the world could eat steamed buns and even meat intestines. It was to the point that they were willing to risk danger to follow Tian, whose army, all for the sake of being able to eat their fill. Tian, who also had a headache about these people following him, so he quickly sent a telegram to Yang Qindong to ask for instructions on how to solve this problem. Soon there was a reply. Yang Qindong ordered that in view of the heavy losses suffered by the Third Army, they could consider recruiting young and strong soldiers from the people on the spot. As for the other people, they could be arranged to build roads from Oxino City to Bulgar City. Later, there would be a logistics team transporting food and fodder there. Whether it was the Golden Horde or the Rossi Principalities, in Yang Qindong's eyes, the most valuable thing was people. This place was vast and sparsely populated, and people were the foundation of all things. As long as there was enough labor for him to use, whether it was mining or obtaining other information, the speed would be much faster. He had already sent a telegram to Achaemen City, requesting for a few mining teams. However, the number of people was limited, and some of the basic labor needed people to do. Population was extremely important. After receiving the order, Tian, who followed the instructions in the telegram and recruited the people into the city. He assigned them jobs according to their age and also provided them with food. He also promised that if they performed well, they would be paid more, and the amount would not be too little. As long as they were willing to work hard, the money they earned would not only be able to feed their families, but also improve their quality of life. Being paid for work was a matter of course. How could they work without physical strength? Even so, the food was only 30% full, and they would not starve to death, not to mention being paid for their work. When had the people here ever heard of such a good life? Soon, more and more people were heading to Oxino City. Many people who lived far away also came in droves when they heard the news. Although they did not know whether this was true or not, it still gave them hope for survival. Although many of them had opened up some fertile land nearby to survive, every time it was time to harvest, the White Russians would come out to plunder. Often, a year's worth of hard work would be for nothing. Now that they could enter the city to work, their safety was guaranteed. As for whether they would be paid or not, they did not dare to ask for too much. At the very least, they would be provided with food. The number of people coming to seek refuge increased day by day. Tian, Hu, and Wu Sheng were naturally overjoyed. They quickly sent out a large number of people to maintain law and order. At the same time, they formed a temporary department in charge of settling the people. For a time, the city was very lively. Some people were happy, while others were worried. When the news spread to the Rossi Principalities and the White Russian nobles, they could not remain calm. These people were not pure White Russians. In their eyes, they were the lowest existences. They were targets that could be taken as they wished. They looked down on such people in their hearts and did not treat them as their own. However, if someone wanted to snatch people from them, they would not allow it. What's wrong? I can bully my people, and I can even slaughter them. But outsiders are absolutely not allowed. Otherwise, when I need food and labor in the future, where will they go to find them? If the entire country's people followed suit and asked for food and wages just to work for them, wouldn't they go bankrupt? The nobles were not willing, and the matter was quickly reported to the Grand Duke of Blindness. They begged the Grand Duke to uphold justice for them. Under great pressure, the Grand Duke of Blindness had no choice but to change his previous strategy and consider sending troops to the 5-star army. Spies had already reported that the five-star army had conquered 4 cities of the Golden Horde. Not only that, but they also fought a big battle outside Kazan City. As for the results, there was still no news. Even the scouts of the Golden Horde could not get any specific information, let alone the weaker Rossi principalities. Chapter 1430. But no matter what, it was always a good thing for these two opponents to fight. According to the Grand Duke of Blindness' strategy, what they needed to do was to watch the two tigers fight and let them suffer. Then, when they were tired of fighting, they would quickly attack and secure victory. But now, what happened in Oxino City had crossed their bottom line. It was unrealistic to want to watch the battle. Summoning a group of generals and nobles, the Grand Duke of Blindness discussed the deployment of troops. In view of the previous defeat in Tove City, the request this time was to not deploy troops. If they did, they would definitely win. They had to drive the five-star army out of their own territory. At the same time, they had to kill those Russian peasants who had defected to the five-star army as an example to others. They had to be dealt with as a warning to others that if they wanted to defect to the five-star army, they had to be prepared to be killed. In this regard, the nobles in the meeting naturally agreed. In order for the army to achieve a great victory, they took the initiative to offer a sum of money as a reward to the soldiers who had contributed to this battle. Of course, they would not give in vain. The captives of this battle would become the new slaves of these nobles. With the high reward, the generals at the meeting became more active. No one would go against the money. Immediately, several generals took the initiative to step forward and asked to lead troops to suppress the five-star army. In this regard, Ivan looked on coldly from the sidelines. His eyes were filled with mockery and coldness. The existence of nobles restricted the development of the Russian Empire. These people were unscrupulous and short-sighted. Wherever there were benefits, they would be there. But when it came to offering, they would become mute and start to retreat. Moreover, these people were extremely united. Often, when they went overboard and the father wanted to deal with one of them, the others would jump out to plead for mercy. Sometimes they would even threaten the other party. The nobles who had both power and money gave the Grand Duke of Blindness a headache. When there was a huge beast like the Golden Horde outside, even though he was dissatisfied, he had to lower his head and feign civility. Sometimes, for the benefit of the nobles, he had to give up his own gains and lose the hearts of the people. This had already begun to hinder the development of the country. If the blind Grand Duke could see those drawbacks, how could the smart Ivan not see them? However, they couldn't fall out with him yet. Otherwise, the country would be riddled with internal strife before anyone else did anything. Under Ivan's cold gaze, the various nobles participated in the meeting enthusiastically. Very quickly, it was decided that Maxim would lead 10,000 White Russian musketeers, 10,000 White Russian cavalry, 30,000 White Russian infantry, and 80,000 White Russian and Mongol slaves, for a total of 130,000 soldiers. Maxim was naturally able to snatch this job because he was an important leader of the city of Novgorod in the Rossi Duchy. He was also one of the generals with the greatest authority apart from the Grand Duke of Blindness. Normally, this person could be said to be a sly old fox. He wouldn't make a move if there were no benefits. Even during the war with the Golden Horde, this person wouldn't act unless there were benefits. Many times, the blind Grand Duke had to use a negotiating tone to persuade him to make a move. This time, he seemed to have the five-star army in his grasp. After all, according to the battle report, the five-star army's reinforcements only had 30,000 to 40,000 cavalry. As for the previous Wu Sheng Third Corps, it had already been destroyed. The thing that was least needed to defend a city was cavalry. The most useless thing was also cavalry. It was just that 30,000 to 40,000 enemies weren't good at defending a city, so they were easy to deal with. Thinking that he had found an opportunity, Maxim took the initiative to ask for troops. Naturally, the nobles were very supportive. Those who had money contributed, and those who had things contributed. The matter was quickly settled. Then, like stars surrounding the moon, they accompanied Maxim out of the hall. In the end, only the blind Grand Duke and his son were left. The blind Grand Duke was very optimistic about his son. Even if the Tove City army was defeated, he still thought highly of Ivan. He even thought that it wasn't a bad thing for a young man to encounter some setbacks. On the contrary, it would be helpful for his future growth. After seeing that there was no one else in the hall, Ivan spoke. He knew why his father wanted him to stay alone, so he simply said bluntly, "Father-in-law, your son doesn't think highly of Maxim's campaign this time. The Han people aren't that easy to defeat. They are likely to hit a wall." "Oh, are our guns and cannons not enough?" the Grand Duke of Blindness asked curiously from his high seat. If we push forward layer by layer with the power of our guns and cannons, there is still a possibility of victory. But if we are too arrogant, then we will definitely fail." "That's right. Turgenev's defeat is an example." Ivan hesitated for a moment, then said with a firm tone. Ivan's meaning was very clear. If he led the army in this battle, then they would win. If it was someone else, then it would be hard to say. The blind Grand Duke laughed. How could he not understand his son's meaning? Wasn't this what he wanted? Just like how Ivan saw the arrogance of the nobles. How could the blind Grand Duke not know this? Although his eyes weren't very good, he understood in his heart. If he wanted to revitalize the Russian Empire, these nobles would undoubtedly become an extremely heavy stumbling block. If he didn't kick them to the side, then problems would occur sooner or later. However, seeing a problem in many things didn't mean that it could be solved. The nobles were very united. They would only do things that would benefit them. If there were no benefits, they would pretend to be confused and stay away. Even if someone wanted to scheme against them, there was no better way. This time, the nobles recommended Maxim to take action because they saw that the Han people had more powerful cannons and wanted to take them for themselves. Moreover, the Han people had 40,000 cavalrymen. War horses had always been something that the Russian Empire needed the most. It was because of these benefits that the nobles took action. However, they forgot about Turgenev's defeat. It must be said that the nobles couldn't be blamed. It was because Turgenev cared too much about his reputation. When he returned, he didn't mention that he had escaped. He only said that the Han army's cannons were too powerful. Seeing that he was no match for them, he couldn't possibly use human lives to make up for it. This made everyone unable to see the true strength of the Han army. Back to business. Although the blind Grand Duke knew that the Han people weren't to be trifled with, he didn't stop them. He also wanted to use this opportunity to deal a heavy blow to the nobles' strength. This would play a positive role in his better governance of the Russian Empire. Once Maxim's army was defeated, he would send his own troops to Oxino City. If he won the battle, not only would he reap the benefits, he would also be able to consolidate his authority. More importantly, he would be able to effectively intimidate the nobles. This was a good thing that could satisfy all three goals. This was what the blind Grand Duke was thinking. However, there were some things that he couldn't say out loud, even to his own son. Firstly, he couldn't leave any evidence for others to talk about. Secondly, he could use this opportunity to teach his son a lesson and let him understand the scheming of an emperor. "All right, you may leave." Knowing that he had asked all the questions he needed to ask, the Grand Duke of Blindness waved his hand with a smile. The blind Grand Duke could see everything clearly because his wisdom was unmatched. Moreover, his mind was very clear. However, the nobles couldn't do it. Just as Ivan thought, they were a group of short-sighted people. Once they saw benefits, they were like flies that saw an egg with a crack. That kind of desire couldn't be controlled. Maxim, who had been elected, was also very pleased with himself. This time, in order to support him in the war, the nobles had given him a lot of military funds. Although it was said that after the war, he would have to divide the victory according to the nobles' investment. However, he was still satisfied with the noble's actions. At least he could see the noble's support for him. After reaching Maxim's position, it would be impossible to say that he didn't have any ambition. He also wanted to become a high and mighty existence, like the blind Grand Duke. To achieve this, he had to achieve great results. Previously, when he faced the Mongol cavalry, he lacked confidence. However, now that he was facing the Han people who were known as two-legged sheep, he had no reason to be afraid. In his view, as long as his army caused trouble, the Han people would very likely flee in fear. He could even win without fighting. With great confidence and excitement, Maxim gathered his troops and set out 5 days later. His target was Oxino City. At this time in Oxino City, the Third Star Army had finished replenishing its troops. Under the temptation of extremely high pay and treatment, no less than 20,000 young and middle-aged commoners joined the army. Even so, there were many youths who weren't chosen for various reasons and left with regrets. This was the benefit of having a strong economy. Many transport teams came from the Far East region. While they brought large amounts of food, they also brought salt, sugar, iron pots, soy sauce, vinegar, cotton clothes, and other necessities for the commoners. When these things appeared in the shops of Oxino City, who knew how many commoners were blinded by them, it was to the point that every shop had to be guarded by the 5-Star Army. Even so, there were still many commoners pacing back and forth in front of the shops. They didn't have the Chinese currency that the 5-Star Army had mentioned, so they naturally couldn't buy these goods. However, even if they couldn't buy them, they could still look at them. Of course, not all commoners had the ability to buy them. For example, there were some new recruits who had just joined the 5-Star Army. In order to encourage them and set an example, Wu Shang and Tian who discussed and gave out a portion of their allowance. Just like that, they had the first batch of customers. When the White Russian and Mongolian recruits wearing clean and tidy military uniforms took out their Chinese coins and bought some daily necessities that made people envious, the other commoners were in an uproar. They only hated that their children hadn't been accepted by the 5-Star Army. Otherwise, they would have been part of the people who had these good things. Chapter 1431. Just when everyone was waiting anxiously, Tian who announced a new policy. As long as the people were willing to help the 5-Star Army to build roads, they would be able to receive Chinese coins. Although the amount was not much, it was still a path, a hope. Wasn't it? Immediately, the citizens who had such thoughts but didn't have the ability to join the army filled up the sign-up area. With the problem of manpower solved, Tian Hu and Wu Sheng could finally relax and focus on building up the army. At this time, another transport team entered the city. Along with it was the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Division of the Cold Front. The 4th Regiment's commander, Ling Lianquan, was ordered by Yang Qindong to come and support the defense of Oxino City. The White Russian army had many firearms. If they wanted to deal with them, they would need the help of firearms. Therefore, the Cold Front came. Not only that, they also brought a large number of weapons and ammunition. They looked like they were going to fight a protracted war with the White Russian army. According to Yang Qindong's plan, they were going to attack one side at a time. Naturally, they were going to attack the Golden Horde. The intelligence department had already reported that the Golden Horde, which had been around for hundreds of years, had a very strong foundation, especially since their ancestors had once dominated the Eastern European continent. They had plundered many good things, most of which were now in their national treasury. If they took them down first, they would be able to get their hands on many good things. It would also solve the financial pressure on the 5-Star Army. Yang Xie was very good at making money, especially when they produced products that were ahead of their time. Their products had always been highly sought after by various factions. It was an understatement to say that they made a lot of money every day. However, in the past few years, whether it was research or military campaigns, they had spent a lot of money. If it wasn't for the fact that Laos, Vietnam, and other provinces had stabilized and didn't need to invest in them anymore, they wouldn't have been able to support 3 battles at the same time with their current financial resources. Their financial resources were barely enough. During this period, Yang Qindong had even issued 3 government bonds in Yangtze's territory. Even so, when the decision was made to send troops to the Far East, there were still a few people who opposed it. One of the most important reasons was the financial pressure. They chose to start with the Golden Horde because of their wealth. If what the intelligence department said was true, and the Golden Horde had a large amount of gold and silver, then the cost of the war would not be a problem. If they did well, they could even make a lot of money back. It was also a good way to take a gamble on those who opposed them. Since they had decided to go all out to deal with the Golden Horde, they could not go all out against the Rossi forces. They had to be on the defensive. Commander Ling Lianchuan had received this order and had come to Oxino City. Tian, who naturally welcomed the arrival of the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment, which boosted his confidence. However, Wu Sheng, Chen Yang, and the others were even happier. They were all Lung Feng's subordinates and belonged to the first group of people to play with guns. However, because they came to Eastern Europe and were too far away from headquarters, their guns ran out of ammunition. After a long time, they started to play with cold weapons again. A while ago, when Wu Xing found out that Lung Feng was going to send people over, he sent Chunyang to transport the unloaded guns that he had buried into the city. Now, they only had to wait for the arrival of the Lung Feng regiment to resume the era of firearms. They had guns and ammunition, but most of the people who used them were no longer around. After searching through the entire Third Army, they only managed to find 100 or so of their old comrades. Thus, they could only form a company of Cold Vanguard and be incorporated into the Third Army's Guard Regiment. The arrival of the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment strengthened the city's defenses. At this time, the intelligence department at the front lines sent news that the White Russian Army had mobilized 50,000 soldiers and 80,000 slaves and were marching towards Oxino City. They would reach the city in about 4 days. When they heard that the White Russian Army was coming, Tian Hu and the others were not afraid at all. Instead, they were very excited. Although the 6th young master had said that they were not allowed to take the initiative to attack, since the enemy was at their doorstep, they would not let them go. This was a good opportunity to perform. For days was enough for the 2 commanders and the regiment commander to make all the necessary arrangements. In the end, they decided that this time they would take down all of the 130,000 enemies. It just so happened that the construction of the roads was a bit slow. With the addition of these new soldiers, it would be much faster. The Third Army had just recruited new soldiers and had only trained them for less than half a month. It was obviously irresponsible to send such an army to the battlefield. In the end, they were left on the city walls to be responsible for guarding the city. Normally, they would have a chance to fight a big battle while defending the city. Especially since the enemy was the main attacker this time, there should be an even more intense battle to defend the city. However, Commander Wu Xing was very clear that he would not have a chance to perform well this time. According to the plan, when the enemy appeared, the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment would use their firepower to suppress them. While the enemy was in chaos, the 4th Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Regiment would charge out from all directions and destroy the enemy. It was easy to say. After all, the enemy had an army of over 100,000. Logically speaking, it would not be easy to defeat them. However, since it was the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Regiment of the Cold Front Regiment, Wu Sheng did not have any doubts. He also understood that the so-called defending the city was just watching from the sidelines. Wu Sheng did not want to watch the others fight and eat the meat and soup while he could only watch from the sidelines. After the meeting, he returned to the army and immediately issued an order. Once the battle went smoothly, the entire Third Army would be sent out. Although they were not very strong and could not inflict heavy damage to the enemy, they should be able to capture captives, right? For this reason, he even came up with a set of rewards. For example, what would be the reward for capturing 1 captive and what would be the reward for capturing 2 captives? The order was quickly passed down through the military headquarters to the various divisions, regiments, battalions, companies, platoons, and finally every squad. When the new soldiers heard that the enemy was the 130,000 soldiers of the White Russians, they were so scared that they did not know what to do. Some of the more timid ones even trembled all over. They looked as if they could be beaten to the ground with a slap at any time. However, when the rewards were announced, the new soldiers who came back to their senses became excited again. Without exception, they were all children of poor families. At least 80% of them were used to being looked down upon and treated coldly when they were growing up. In their minds, their lives were cheap and they didn't know when they could die. But now, it was the 5-star army of the Han people who gave them respect and dignity. They could eat their fill, wear new clothes, and earn money. Now that there was an opportunity to perform meritorious deeds in front of them, why would they not give it a try? At most, they would die. However, if they could survive and perform meritorious deeds, wouldn't that improve the living conditions of their families? If they did well, it was not impossible for them to become a role model for their families. There were not many people who were shameless. The new soldiers who had just enjoyed the taste of being respected liked this feeling even more. Now that there was an even better opportunity to perform meritorious deeds in front of them, although they were still a little afraid, the rewards of victory had stimulated them to forget all their fears. They secretly decided that if there was an opportunity to perform meritorious deeds, they would do it even if it meant risking their lives. Time passed day by day. Outside Oxino City, the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front had already dug trenches. The crisscrossing trenches were the most effective way to deal with cavalry and artillery. They had already learned that the White Russians had guns and cannons. It seemed that their strength was not bad. However, in reality, the enemy's cannons were mostly solid bullets. These cannons could fire up to 3 to 4 li away. Although it looked terrifying, if the trenches were set up, the metal balls would be turned into scrap metal before they could even reach them. The White Russians also had exploding bullets, but their attack range was limited. It was only about 1 li. At such a close range, they would have some advantage against cold weapons. However, against the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front, they were too weak. They were so weak that they would not even give the enemy a chance to fire. After the trenches were dug, the world's #1 cavalry army followed their plan and left the city in batches in the middle of the night. They jumped out of the battlefield and formed an even larger encirclement. When the enemy appeared, they would counter-encircle them and press the White Russians to the ground. Everything was ready. On the afternoon of the 4th day after receiving the news, a black mass of people appeared in the distance of Oxino City. The White Russians had finally arrived. They arrived in the afternoon. After waiting for the rear troops to arrive, the entire army camp stretched for more than 10 li. It looked majestic and gave people a feeling that they were invincible. Riding on this momentum, General Maxim led a group of people to the front of the formation. They saw the trenches that the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front had dug. These things are complicated and won't be easy to deal with. The White Russian general in charge of the 10,000 musketeers said with a serious expression, "It doesn't matter if it's easy or not. We have 80,000 slaves with us. Even if we have to use their lives, we will fill up these trenches. How about this? Let's fire a few cannons to show our military might." Maxim said with an unconcerned expression. From his point of view, he already had a huge advantage in terms of military strength. In addition, the nobles were very supportive this time, providing him with 100 cannons. Among them, there were 10 exploding cannons. The amount of ammunition they had prepared was also very ample. There was no city that they could not take down. Under Maxim's order, dozens of cannons were fired at the same time before the sky turned dark, smashing towards Oxino City. However, because of the trenches, they all fell into the trenches after rolling for a while. To this he did not care. In fact, he even arrogantly believed that the appearance of these trenches would restrict the charge of the Han cavalry. This way, he would have the complete initiative and could do whatever he wanted. Chapter 1432. After a series of explosions, the White Russian army started to set up their tents and cook. When Ling Lianquan saw this scene, he was furious. The other side's disregard made him feel insulted, and he suddenly had a bold idea. Since the other party was looking down on them, why couldn't they turn around and launch a surprise attack on them? Night raids were one of the subjects that the cold front soldiers often trained in. Their meals were always good, and they didn't have any problems with night blindness. Adding on a surprise attack, they could catch the other side off guard. After coming up with this bold idea, Ling Lianquan first returned to the city to report to the commander of the 3rd Corps, Wu Sheng. Wu Sheng, who also felt that it was feasible, agreed, and then immediately communicated with the commander of the 1st Corps, Tian Hu, who was lying in ambush outside. Tian Hu, who didn't adhere to tactics, naturally didn't object. He couldn't wait any longer and didn't want to spend another night. It would be best if they could attack a minute earlier. After the three reached a consensus, a new battle plan was formed. There weren't many changes from before, but the time of attack was brought forward. The weather in Eastern Europe in August was quite good. Even at night, not only was it not hot, but it was also quite cool. The White Russian army, who had been rushing for a few days, quickly fell asleep. Many of them had excited expressions on their faces, as if they were already dreaming of breaking through the gates of Oxino City and massacring the Hans. In the trench, 300 meters in front of the White Russian camp, Commander Ling Lianquan had already led 2,000 cold front soldiers to take a detour, and they were ready to attack at any time. Raising his wrist to look at the military watch, Ling Lianquan solemnly said to the radio operator beside him, "Prepare the signal gun!" About 10 seconds later, a red signal flare rose into the air. In the dark and silent night, it was very eye-catching and dazzling. The rise of the signal flare also signified the start of the counterattack. At this moment, the cannons roared, and the 8 100mm mortars of the 4th Regiment began to let out their unique roar. Of the 8 cannons, 4 of them were aimed at the White Russian Army's cannon formation, while the other 4 were casually fired at the White Russian camp. Every time a cannonball landed, it would cause the earth to tremble, and there would be cries and screams. The cannonballs were completely random. Some hit 2 to 3 miles away, while others landed 7 to 8 miles away. This created a feeling of gunfire everywhere. There were enemies everywhere. It was a general trend of insecurity. The first to be completely destroyed was the artillery formation of the White Russian Army. The 100 cannons were originally placed together for the sake of concentrating them to gain the upper hand. Now, the cold front 4th Regiment was able to destroy all the cannons effortlessly. Some of them landed on the cannonballs of the exploding cannonballs and immediately caused them to explode, causing the flames to soar into the sky and increasing the power of the cannonballs. The White Russian Army was completely unprepared and did not expect the Han Chinese to have cannons as well, so they were caught off guard. When Maxim walked out of the tent, he saw countless people running around like headless flies in the chaotic camp. Under the random bombardment, no one knew where was the safest. They could only run around helplessly and bet on their luck. Don't panic, don't panic. Everyone gathered together. The enemy's forces are inferior to ours, so they won't dare to charge. In order to stabilize the morale of the soldiers, Maxim roared loudly. Even the soldiers beside him did the same. With so many people shouting in unison, the effect was not bad. At the very least, the camp was no longer as chaotic. Many of the generals also began to look for their subordinates, preparing to launch a counterattack after taking a roll call. However, this action came to an end with the rumbling of hooves. 8 cannons might be able to deal limited damage to an army of more than a dozen miles and an army of more than 100,000 men, But the damage they could inflict on the cavalry coming from all directions was unimaginable. They did not know how many enemies there were, nor did they know where they would appear. Instinctively, the 1,000-man commanders and major commanders began to run around. They no longer had the heart to fight. Right now, they were only thinking about how to escape from the chaos. The No. 1 Cavalry Army had finally made their move. This was the first time they had attacked together ever since they became a first-class unit. As the commander, Tian, who was very excited. The 5 division commanders below him were also very excited. Everyone had the desire to compete with each other. Using platoons as a unit, they formed hundreds of arrow formations that came from all directions. The high-speed warhorses and sharp divine weapons allowed them to charge into the White Russian army like killing gods in the night. With a raise of their weapons, countless White Russians were beheaded. Countless cowardly rats threw down their weapons and lay on the ground, trembling. They were all begging for their lives. This was an unequal battle. There was no such thing as fairness. On one side, there was an unbridled slaughter. They displayed their bloodthirsty methods and opened their bloody mouths. On the other side, there were people fleeing in all directions. The generals did not know their soldiers, and the soldiers did not know their generals. In the chaos, there were countless people who ran away. Maxim was also fleeing crazily on his horse under the protection of dozens of bodyguards. His face was filled with fear, especially when a cannonball landed 7 or 8 meters away from him. The powerful shockwave sent one of his soldiers flying. That feeling of fear became even more intense. Right now, he was no longer thinking about fighting with the 5-star army. He only wanted to flee far away. It would be best if they never met again. If the commander was like this, one could only imagine how the soldiers were feeling. They were all busy fleeing. If they could not escape, they would just surrender. The 80,000 slaves following the army were doing much better. They were originally unable to control their own fate. Now that their master's army had been defeated, they were just slaves of the White Russians. It did not matter. They just had to surrender. Just like that, the 80,000 slaves chose to surrender without any burden. This allowed the No. 1 Cavalry Army, which originally did not have the advantage in numbers, to finally have the advantage in numbers. They began to chase after the fleeing White Russian army. Within Oksino City, the southern gate was already open. The 30,000 soldiers of the Third Army rushed out and charged toward the battlefield. When the cannons had been fired, they had been watching from the city walls. When they saw the previously insufferably arrogant White Russian army lose the ability to resist in such a short period of time, their eyes were filled with excitement. This meant that they would not encounter any danger in the process of snatching captives. It would be much smoother. At this moment, many of the nervous and fearful recruits raised their heads high. They were as proud as a general who had just won a battle. Finally, the 4th Regiment of the Cold Front charged out of the trenches. Relying on the 95 style in their hands, they continuously charged and fired. Whenever they discovered a White Russian soldier holding a weapon, regardless of their status, whether they were a general or a soldier, they would fire a bullet at them. Their bravery caused the White Russian army, who were already in a sorry state, to feel as if they had lost their parents. Their desire to resist was quickly suppressed. The 4th Regiment of the Cold Front also launched an attack. Behind them, the Third Army also charged out, making full use of their advantage in numbers. This battle lasted from midnight all the way to noon the next day. When more and more civilians climbed up the city walls and saw the scene in front of them, who knew how many of them shed tears of joy, the 5-star army had arrived. They could finally eat their fill and wear warm clothes. There was finally hope for their lives. However, most people were not happy because they did not know how long this kind of life could last. Their many years of experience told them that the White Russian army would not sit back and watch this happen. As expected, not long after, they heard that the White Russian army had sent 130,000 soldiers to Oksino City. At this moment, many people revealed expressions of fear. The civilians who had originally wanted to save up Chinese coins to buy better goods also hurriedly spent their money. They were afraid that the five-star army would be defeated by the White Russian army. If that happened, the Chinese coins in their hands would be worthless. Rather than that, it was better to buy things that they had already bought. At the very least, it was something that truly existed. Just yesterday, when they heard that the White Russian army had arrived, many civilians had already packed up their things. They had made the decision that if the five-star army was defeated, they would seize the city and leave. Although the five-star army had treated them well and was much better than the White Russian army, in this chaotic world, there was no such thing as morality. Barely surviving was the most important thing. But no one could have imagined that in just one night, the seemingly powerful White Russian army would be defeated. Moreover, it was a crushing defeat. They didn't even have the ability to counterattack. Not even a single hole could be found on the walls of Oxino City. On the city walls, the civilians cheered. The five-star army's victory meant that their beautiful lives would continue. There was hope for their future. Some of the civilians also began to regret spending the Chinese coins that they had saved up with great difficulty. Some of them could have bought a good iron pot if they had worked hard. Now, their hopes had been ruined by their own hands. The good thing was that as long as the five-star army was still the ruler of this place, it would not be long before they could achieve what they wanted. The five-star army had won a great victory. The world's #1 cavalry regiment had chased for 40 li before returning. This battle had dealt a heavy blow to the White Russian army. Just in terms of prisoners, they had captured 110,000 people. There were also 10,000 White Russian army corpses on the battlefield. In other words, only 5,000 White Russian soldiers had managed to escape. They had also seized a lot of military rations and equipment. This was not a small gain for Oxino City. Chapter 1433. Report our victory. Report our victory to the 6th young master. Ha ha ha. Tian, whose usual calm demeanor, was replaced with excitement. Not only did a night and half a day of fighting not tire him out, he was also very excited. Because in yesterday's battle he saw the might of the world's #1 cavalry army. In the past, when they were only a division, they could defeat enemies several times their size. And looking at their performance last night, no one could stop the 40,000 cavalry. Even if they were to face 100,000 enemies, they would not back down. They were very confident that they could obtain victory. Soon, Yang Qindong found out about the battle in Oxino City through the telegram. After reading the telegram, he did not think much of it and only chuckled. Very good. After this battle, there will be no more battles here this year. Send a telegram to Tian Hu and Wu Sheng to properly manage the place. Take advantage of the time before it snows to properly repair the roads. After it snows, properly manage the greenhouse. Do not neglect it. Yang Qindong was a person who liked to take one step and look 3 steps ahead. Considering the cold of winter in Eastern Europe, Yang Qindong had ordered a large number of greenhouse workers to be transported from Red Nest City. The land here was fertile, so it would not be difficult to solve the problem of food. He wanted to let the foreign people who followed him, regardless of the reason, know that as long as they followed him, they would not go hungry. As for eating better and wearing better clothes, they would need to work harder. Not only in Oxino City, Yang Qindong had already arranged for people to set up a large number of greenhouses in Polga, Kazan, and the other 3 cities. He was only waiting for the arrival of winter, when they could no longer work outside. They would work indoors. This year, because they were not prepared enough, they would be like this for now. In the future, when they developed, he would also transport steam engines here. At that time, many light industrial products could be chosen to be manufactured here, so that there would be work to do in winter, and this place would not become a paradise for lazy people. The so-called paradise for lazy people referred to the fact that because of the weather, they could only work for half a year and rest for half a year. This was more suitable for those who were naturally lazy. Without something as advanced as the telegram, the news of the defeat of the White Russians was not sent back by fast horse until 3 days later. On this day, the blind Great Justice was having a meeting with the officials in the hall, discussing the matters of preparing for winter. It was also at this moment that the battle report from the front lines came back. The travel-worn signaller knelt on the ground, not even daring to raise his head. From the attitude of the signaller, it was often possible to tell whether the news was good or bad. The officials and nobles who had experience in this aspect looked at each other, speechless. The blind duke, who had already predicted the battle ahead, didn't panic. Instead, he said calmly, "What is the battle ahead? Tell me quickly." "Yes, Grand Duke." After the signaller acknowledged the order, he took out a battle report from a tool that looked like a basket and read it out loud. It was a tradition of the Rossi duchies to read battle reports in public. Perhaps they were afraid that someone would hide battle reports that were unfavorable to them, so they would usually read them out in public when they received battle reports to show fairness. Because of this, Ivan, who was standing at the side, could see the rapid changes in the expressions of the officials and nobles. The battle report didn't have many words, but the amount of information in it wasn't small. Maxim had returned in defeat. Of the 130,000 soldiers, less than 5,000 remained, and they were currently on their way back to Moscow. Not only that, the battle had only taken half a day, and the White Russian army's rations and supplies had all been plundered by the Han army. In just a short while, the officials and nobles of the White Russian army had ugly expressions. They hadn't expected the army to be defeated, and even more so for it to be defeated so quickly. What is this Maxim doing? Is he such a good-for-nothing? We gave him so many cannons and good things, but what did he do? What a disappointment. Maxim was incompetent in training his army, resulting in the defeat of his army. He should be hanged for this crime. That's right, the Rossi duchies don't need incompetent generals. Kill him. Kill him, kill him. Within a short period of time, a large number of voices appeared in the imperial court to condemn Maxim, with the nobles being the heaviest among them. At this moment, they seemed to have forgotten how they had praised Maxim for leading the army. This was the nobles. In their eyes, there were only benefits. It was best not to talk about favors with such people. Otherwise, you would be very sad. The voices were so loud that it felt as if Maxim had committed some heinous crime. Ivan looked at this scene coldly, and he was extremely shocked. He hadn't expected the firearms of the Han to be so powerful, and it seemed to be even more powerful than theirs. If that was the case, not only would they have powerful cavalry, but they would also have firearms. The Han people would truly be a difficult opponent to deal with. Even though Ivan had tried his best to overestimate the strength of the five-star army, he had still underestimated his opponent. The firearms of the five-star army were not just a little bit more powerful than the White Russian army, but much more powerful. Ivan really wanted to experience the power of the five-star army, but it was already the 9th month. If he were to prepare for war now, there wouldn't be enough time. It seemed that he could only leave all his regrets for next year. On the other hand, when the blind Archduke heard that everyone in the court wanted to punish Maxim, he immediately took the opportunity to deprive this person of nearly half of his military power and allowed him to reflect on his crimes at home. He would talk about it when he figured it out. After this battle, he hadn't suffered any losses, but the nobles had suffered heavy injuries. He had also lost a powerful general like Maxim, so the blind duke was naturally in a good mood. He even had to thank the Han army for appearing. At the end of the meeting, the blind duke also said that it was too late this year. After the flowers bloomed tomorrow, he would send troops to attack Oksino City to show the might of the White Russian army. After receiving the promise, the ministers and nobles left the hall with satisfied looks on their faces. To them, the appearance of the Han army was a threat that could even attract ordinary people to follow suit. If they didn't suppress this trend, it would greatly affect their interests. This was not allowed. As long as the Han army was defeated and chased away, It didn't matter who did it in the end. This was the face of the bigwigs. In their eyes, they only cared about their own interests and their own petty schemes. How could the blind Duke not see this? However, he didn't have a better idea. Although he was powerful, his words didn't carry weight in the White Russian army. Without the support of these nobles, the Rossi duchies would have internal strife. If that happened, not to mention dealing with others, it would be a problem for them to protect themselves. For the sake of the Rossi's interests, for the sake of righteousness, he sometimes had to compromise. Although he knew that these nobles were malignant tumors, he had no choice but to keep them. He only hoped that after the Rossi Empire completely controlled this land, they would slowly be eliminated. In fact, this wasn't just a problem of the Rossi Empire. The great Ming Empire also had this characteristic. The nobles and wealthy families were like troublemakers that hindered the development of the great Ming Empire. Although the emperor knew about this, he was powerless to solve it. On this point, Yang Xie was the best. In history, any king who founded a country did very well. This was because they started from nothing, and it was easy for them to centralize power. This allowed their decrees to be quickly passed down. However, in order to stabilize the situation, they had to balance it out. More and more people with real power would appear, and in the end, the power would be dispersed. Even a powerful country wouldn't be able to achieve the cooperation of all its citizens. Yang Qindong was like a king who founded a country. His prestige and authority were unparalleled. Whenever he made a decision, even if someone opposed it, it would be difficult to stop him. In addition, Yang Qindong brought new knowledge, and with the help of Datsang, this great achievement was achieved. Yang Qindong had long been aware of this. He constantly increased the intensity and speed of this construction. Just as winter was about to arrive, and whether it was the Golden Horde or the Rossi principalities, he was still busy commanding the 5-star army. More and more roads were being built, and more greenhouses were being built. Under the lead of Chief Engineer Feng Ku, the most advanced research lab in Chichen City had already upgraded the steam engine 3 times. Now, the steam train was being developed, and most of it had already taken shape. Only a few key steps were needed, and the so-called first steam train could be tested. With the books and knowledge provided by Yang Qindong, once the first steam engine, which was the most difficult part, was built, the rest would be very simple and smooth. When the news of this spread, Chichen City was the first to lay the tracks. A 40-kilometer-long railway was built from the factory to the port. Once it was open to traffic, all the products produced would be sent to the port faster and distributed to the various regions. The laying of the tracks in Laos, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian provinces was also in the final stages. They had already made the preparations and laid the foundation. Now, they only needed to lay the tracks according to the predetermined route. Once the tracks were open to traffic, several provinces would be quickly connected. This way, goods and people could be quickly sent to each other. Once that time came, no matter where the problem was, the army could take the train to arrive in the shortest time possible. This would play a more positive role in stabilizing the security of the territory. The tracks from the 3 eastern provinces to the far east were also being laid. This would be the first railway road in the region. Its role in supplying supplies to Eastern Europe could not be measured by money. Chapter 1434. On the other hand, the railway from the Far East to Eastern Europe wasn't easy to build. It had to pass through the Siberian and Ural regions to reach the Volga region. There were many forests and rivers along the way, which greatly hindered the construction of the railway. For this reason, after Yang Qindong understood the actual situation, he adopted the method of building a bridge when it met a river and digging a hole when it met a mountain. If it was a large mountain, he would take a detour. If it was a small mountain, he would use explosives to flatten it, or dig a hole through which the train could pass through. In these years, Yang Xie's mining work had developed rapidly, and he had the experience and strength to create a cave. Even so, it would take at least a few years to build this railway. Fortunately, Yang Qindong could afford to wait, and what he didn't lack the most now was manpower. Just a moment ago, after the great victory in Oxino City, Tian Hu and Wu Xing had sent another 100,000 people, and they were all young and strong men. With these people, the construction and development of the railway would be greatly promoted. What he needed to do now was to take advantage of the time before it snowed to build a wider and longer road. Once it snowed, some of the work would have to stop, and the transportation of goods couldn't be stopped. For this reason, Yang Qindong had already arranged for a sleigh. It could easily slide through the snow, even if it was full of goods. This way, he could take advantage of the heavy snow to transport more goods into the city. In this way, he would be able to do what he needed to do at the beginning of spring tomorrow. Because of the upcoming snow, Eastern Europe became quiet. Whether they liked it or not, a tripartite situation had already formed. This was one of Yang Qindong's biggest gains after coming here. Compared to Yang Qindong's gains, the Yarkyang and Tuliafin tribes in the Ili Belly region were officially under Yang Xie's control. The 5-star army that was left there had even started a war against Ili Belly. By the time Yang Qindong left, the situation of the war had already become clear. But to everyone's surprise, King Baolite of Ili had been so determined that in order to strike at the 5-star army, he had betrayed the interests of his own country. He had separately asked for help from the nearby Timur Empire, Kazakh, and Yusang, and had also stated that they would provide the provisions for the army. After defeating the 5-star army, the territory would be divided among the 4. When Prime Minister Ali Pu was in charge of Ili, he had accumulated a large amount of military supplies for the entire country. Now they were all being used. The appearance of the 4-way army placed considerable pressure on the 5-star army. The good thing was that the enemy was already at the end of their rope. Compared to the Yang faction, who had a stable rear and a strong economy, they weren't afraid of anyone in a protracted battle. Once the enemy's rations ran out, it would be the time for the 5-star army to win the battle. It just so happened that they could take the opportunity to have a good fight with the 4-nation coalition. It was not a bad thing to wipe out their vital forces. The war on the land had to stop because of the weather, but the expedition on the sea showed no signs of stopping. After occupying Sri Lanka, the Navy had taken Kaji, Giri, Halinos, and other cities. They had now reached the Persian Gulf, and according to their previous plan, they were building a naval supply base here. This place would become a new and important supply base for the Navy when it went on expeditions all over the world. Equipped with powerful firearms and cannons, they had the world's most elite cold vanguard navy. Wherever the Navy with the 5-star flag went, they were like dragons entering the sea, unstoppable. In the short span of half a year, the wealth they plundered was equivalent to 120 million taels of silver. The number of slaves they plundered from various countries also reached over 6 million. Currently, they had already been sent back to the headquarters in Crimson City through the supply ships. After so many years, the investment in the Navy had never been enough. Now, it was finally time to reap the rewards. When a large amount of gold and silver was sent back to the treasury of Yangxia, Yu Qian and the rest were all smiles. Now, there were no ministers who would stop the Navy from going out to sea. Compared to the wealth in his hands, the change in mindset of the officials made Yang Qindong feel more gratified. Although his authority was not something that could be shaken by the officials, but having people clamoring in his ears every day was not a good thing. This was also one of the reasons why Yang Qindong would rather suffer with the army and risk the dangers of going on expeditions than stay in Kiosk City. He really could not stand the whispers and complaints of the officials every day. However, these people were doing it for his own good. He could not do anything to them, so he could only endure it. And the harvest of the Navy could finally make some people shut their mouths. He could finally have some peace and quiet. All in all, the year 1462 was a year of harvest. It was also the year that Yang Xie expanded outwards. In the past, the main focus of the five-star army was on the grasslands. There were not many gains from fighting there. The other side was so poor that they did not have much wealth. Defeating them would only give them some land and some captives. Compared to the huge expenditure of the army, it felt like they were at a disadvantage. Just like the war with Ely right now, they had invested a lot and gained very little. Because of this, who knew how many officials had already raised their opinions? Even Yu Qian and the rest had vaguely expressed their dissatisfaction. Only then did Yang Qindong decide to expand his army and look for more sources of income, although expanding his army would suddenly increase the pressure on his finances. But if there were gains, then the benefits would be even greater. Fortunately, it seemed like he had made the right choice. At least the expedition on the sea had a good result. In the next year, after Yang Qindong defeated the Golden Horde, his gains would also be great. At that time, the voices of obstructions would be suppressed to a minimum. Because of the weather, the army had to stop their advance. But in Kiosk City, where it was spring all year round, the impact of winter was limited. The factories continued to operate without interruption. All kinds of products were produced and sent to various places. The 70mm field cannons had already overcome all the difficulties and began to be produced in batches. The problem with the explosive shells was also solved. They could now fire up to 8 li away. This allowed them to successfully replace the 100mm mortars used by the five-star army, becoming the main artillery of the army. Speaking of which, although the field cannons were easy to move and could be carried by 4 soldiers, compared to the 100mm mortars, they were still slightly heavier. But the army still gave up on the mortars and changed to field cannons. The reason was because the mortars were all from the warehouse. Even the process of making the shells was very troublesome. With Yang Xie's technology, it was impossible to make such a good thing. They had been imitating it all along. It was like a primary school student suddenly learning middle school and high school knowledge. It was very difficult to learn, but it was not a problem for him to copy the answers. But this was not the way to go in the long run. After dismantling the cannons in the warehouse countless times and copying them, the field cannons were finally produced. Because they were self-made by Yang Xie, all the parts were complete. With all the parts, the number of cannons continued to increase. Finally, it was time to equip the entire army. Although there was still a long way to go before it could be used at will, the production cost of the explosive shells wasn't low, and the production time was not short. However, with the continuous improvement of the steam engine technology, the replacement would be faster and faster. One day, all the complicated problems would be simplified. By then, the production cost of the explosive shells would be infinitely reduced, and the five-star army would really be invincible in the world. A large number of field cannons were produced and shipped to various battlefields. In the warehouse of Kazan City, there was a row of 20 cannons that had just been shipped over. The distance of a few thousand li took these cannons a few months to arrive in front of Yang Qindong. He gently touched these cold field cannons and was very emotional. These were independent cannons made by the Yangxie Munitions factory. Their appearance was enough to prove that their efforts over the years were not in vain. Their technology was finally effective, and he no longer needed to rely on the warehouse. There were still many advanced weapons in the warehouse, but Yang Qindong rarely used them. If a country wanted to develop, it was impossible to rely on one person, not to mention that his goal was the entire world. If he relied on himself, he could survive, but what about the future? After all, he couldn't allow the Hans to fall again just because he left, right? Right now, saving himself was what he had been doing. For the research department led by Feng Ku, Yang Qindong had always given them the best treatment and the best policies. Whatever they wanted to know, whatever they needed to know, he taught them without holding back. The only thing left was to open their heads and directly put things inside. Because of this, who knows how many people were jealous and raised doubts, but they were all suppressed by his words that carried enormous weight. Finally, his efforts paid off, and Yang Qindong could finally let out a sigh of relief. In the past, he only relied on his personal authority to promote policies and methods. But now that more and more people understood what he was doing, there was no need to explain anything to them. "Young master, these field cannons are too ugly." Beta Persei, who did not know what Yang Qindong was thinking, also touched the field cannon and even lifted it up to feel its bulkiness. He then shook his head and said with some dissatisfaction, "What do you know?" Yang Qindong snorted coldly. He was very disdainful of Beta Persei's short-sightedness. This was a self-produced product that belonged to the modern era. Mortars were things in the warehouse and belonged to artillery hundreds of years later. How could they be compared? You're tuning in to the Thunder Spear YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.